Right. Hi everyone. Hopefully you can all see my screen. And we're just waiting to make sure everyone can come into the conference. So I'll just give it another minute. And then I'm going to welcome you to the ISPAR conference for 2021. Okay, so hi, welcome to the ISPAR conference for 2021. This is day 3 of the Improvement Through Movement conference. My name's Dr. Ruth James, and I will be presenting the conference today for you with the help of Aldous, who is going to be helping with all the presentations and making sure it all runs smoothly as well. So if someone can just give me a smile or a nod if we're all able to hear me. Yeah, Angel's nodding away, I'm okay. So just as a little overview, if you weren't here for day 1, just wanted to make sure you're aware that ISPAR, or the Institute for Sport and Physical Activity, is the research institute that we've got at the University of Bedfordshire. And we are on day 3. If you have missed day 1 and day 2, you can always catch up because we do have them available on YouTube. And if you want to interact with us today at any point, you can use the chat function on Zoom, or you can go into YouTube and leave questions, or you can get involved through Twitter, and we're keeping an eye on all of them. So if you do want to get involved, please let us know if you've got any questions or just want to have a bit of a chat. So just so you're all aware, this is who we are and this is what we do. So we've got a variety of ISPAR staff that we've got on the left-hand side, with Professor Angel Chatter, who is leading the ISPAR Institute. And we've got Dr. Martin Morris, who is deputy, but runs the Sports Science and Physical Activity department at the University of Bedfordshire. Massive thanks both to Angel herself for the institute, but also to everyone on the committee that puts the ISPAR conference together. Also a massive thanks to all our ISPAR postgraduates, a lot of who you will see today. They support the institute and they make great research that is coming out of here, and they contribute also to the committee as well that helps build this conference. So big thank you to all of them. So brief overview of what we've got today. Obviously this programme is all available on your Eventbrite link. So if you want to go back and have a look at that, please do. But just to give you a heads up, I'm going to just remind everyone of when the breaks are coming and what's coming up. So you've got a very short welcome from me that should finish in about a minute. And then we're welcoming Dr. Ruth James. We've got a little break afterwards, so we can just make sure that any questions that we've got for her are all addressed. Followed by some of our students from the ISPAR Institute presenting their work with a Q&A. We're then going to have another short break because we're trying to make sure that everyone's standing up and getting active today. And then we've got some more students presenting before, at the end, we've got an alumni keynote speaker as well, with a very short roundup from me at the end of the day, being 1 o'clock. So we should stick to time, but please give me a shout if you need anything throughout this. So with no further ado, because I really don't want to be doing lots of talking today, it should be, I'm just going to make sure I've stopped sharing. We're going to move on to our keynote presentation from Dr. Ruth James. Dr. Ruth James is a principal lecturer in nutrition and exercise physiology at Nottingham Trent University. She's got a wide range of topics, as you can see from the screen, of what she's going to be talking about today, and is a really inspiring person. So I hope you can all give her a bit of a warm welcome. Normally would be a round of applause now, but you can all get involved with her, and please put any questions in the chat, or you can ask at the end if you want to. So over to you, Ruth, if you're ready.
Just have to remember to unmute myself. Good morning, everybody. Yeah, it's a real shame, obviously, to not be seeing you all face to face, but it's life at the moment. I suppose we're all probably used to it by now. Firstly, thank you to Rebecca for asking me to come and talk to you all, and for the organising committee for putting this on. And so when Rebecca asked me to talk about my research, that was really exciting, but also a bit problematic, because I have quite a broad spectrum of things that I dabble in. And I thought that based on the sort of broad spectrum of the audience for this conference, that actually what I would try and present was research that I've done that I've not actually published yet. Because we've got that mix of sort of undergrad, postgrad, and then sort of established academics, I thought that actually, although this talk is going to jump around, that for undergraduates, it gives a bit of an idea of the breadth of topics available in sports science, and really for this, just within sort of physiology and nutrition. So it gives a bit of an idea of the fact that if you decide to go on to a sort of physiology further education, that actually even then you're not really narrowing down your options. There's still a huge area to research. And then for the staff that are attending, I thought, well, actually anything I've published you can just go and read anyway, so there's not a lot of point in presenting that. And I also don't want to present a sort of lecture style, because that's sort of teaching you to suck eggs. So I thought the best thing is to just dig up some of my stuff that I haven't gotten around to publishing yet. I hope that yet is the right word, and I will get round to it one of these days. So that's the idea of this, is that I do appreciate
recording in progress.
Oh, something's just told me something's. Rebecca, are you still there?
I'm here. You're
okay.
right.
Yeah, it just Zoom's just sent me a message, but anyway, I'll just leave it and carry on if we're okay.
Yeah,
okay,
sure.
So let's just progress. And now it's not letting me progress. There we go, we're winning. Okay, so the first topic I wanted to talk to you about is exercise in the heat. And obviously even that is just a massive topic. So the thing I'm going to talk to you about is the use of menthol to try and counteract the negative effects of exercising in the heat. So menthol is one of the derivatives in peppermint, and it gives us that sort of minty sensation. And we can use it either in a mouth rinse solution, or you can apply it topologically, so i.e. to the skin. And what it effectively does when you do that is it activates the TRPM8 receptors, and they then send messages to the brain basically to trigger a sensation of cooling. And that then sort of tricks the brain into feeling that the body feels cooler, which if you think about exercising in the heat, that could improve your thermal comfort. It will improve your perceived exertion, and therefore your overall ability to tolerate the heat. If you've mouth rinsed with it or ingested it, then it can sometimes help with your breathing, or at least your perception of breathing. And again, if it's applied to the skin, if it's applied topologically, then you can feel skin cooling sensation. So I've taken this slide from Asker Jukendrup. Obviously, it's a bit too professional to be my slide. So it's an excellent little infographic about the effect of the mechanism behind how menthol works. And you can see there, it says sort of the results so far shows that we can improve exercise performance in anything lasting sort of 20 to 70 minutes with application of menthol to exercise in the heat. There doesn't seem to be any benefits for intermittent exercise. And then just to slightly update this infographic, there's now some evidence emerging actually in sort of time to exhaustion, that actually by providing menthol just really near the end of that exercise bout can actually improve performance as well. Now, the problem with menthol, as I've sort of touched on, is yes, you can ingest it, you can mouth rinse it, you can also put it on the skin. Then there's also different concentrations that are used. So you can see here the mouth rinse concentrations go from 0.01 up to 0.1%, whereas the topological concentrations tend to be quite a lot higher, anything up to about 8%. Then we've got, again, as with any sort of mouth rinse or ingestion, the volume that's used, but that also translates over onto the topological application. How much of the body area, how much of the body surface area are you putting that menthol on? And therefore, what extent do you expect their sort of TRPM8 receptors to be activated? Coupled with that, the TRPM8 receptors aren't actually evenly distributed across the body, so they're likely to be in much more dense receptor endings in some areas of the body than others. So it's a bit of a complicated area. Coupled with that, then obviously we've got all the normal variables with exercise, so mode of exercise, duration of exercise, intensity of exercise, and so on. So it's a little bit of a muddled picture. It's still an emerging area of research. So what I did quite a few years ago now is we had a look at what the effect of menthol was just in a resting situation. And this was a preemptive study to an exercise study. But it sort of went astray, and I'll show you why now. So we took 24 males and they rested in 33 degrees C with a very minimal wind and about 66% relative humidity. So that would have been approximately thermoneutral, and they were just wearing shorts. So obviously if we'd have had it any cooler, it would have really felt quite chilly for them. We applied a 1% menthol solution. So we dissolved the menthol into methylated spirits, sort of bright purple solution that we were sloshing over people. And we soaked patches in those solutions and then covered the patch in a plastic sealant. We did that to try and reduce, well, to avoid the effect of evaporation and convective cooling over the area. But again, like I've covered, it's actually complicated because some ways that convective cooling is, adds in another dimension to the effect of the menthol. So we tried to standardize that out rather than trying to standardize it within. And then out of interest, so we placed the patches on the upper back, either side of the spine, each forearm on the underside of the forearm, and then on the forehead as well. And the left forearm patch was always the placebo solution, even on the menthol trial. And that was so that participants had a direct comparison at that moment for the difference between their two arms. They weren't told that the two patches were different. They just had to mark on a thermal sensation scale how they felt their left arm felt and how they felt their right arm felt. And they were completely blinded to any of those contents of what the solutions contained. So this is a little schematic just to give you an idea. So we took their body mass before and after the trials, again, just to check for any sweat losses or anything like that. You can see the red arrows are where they entered and exited the chamber. So we sat them in the chamber for 30 minutes to try and acclimate them. So we took skin temperature, core temperature, heart rate, thermal sensation and thermal comfort every 10 minutes in that standardizing period. And then we also measured blood flow. We measured blood flow using a laser Doppler, and that was placed just distal to the patch on both the left and the right forearm. And then we increased the rate of sampling during the time that they were in the chamber. So that was 80 minutes that they were in the chamber. And you can see we measured the temperature, sensations and heart rate every 5 minutes and blood flow every 10. And then they exited the chamber and we checked their body mass again. And they did that on obviously 2 separate occasions, separated by a week. And that's why we needed to keep the placebo patch. Okay, so what did we find? Well, in the bog standard analysis that we ran, as we expected to, we found differences in the thermal sensation, which I'll come to, but in the overall thermal sensation, there was no difference. Heart rate, no difference. Skin temperature, no difference. So we found no difference in any of the parameters when we looked at the cohort of all 24 individuals menthol trial versus the control trial. So it's a standard sort of crossover design analysis that's what we had intended to do. But what we did notice was that actually it was not as simple as we had hoped, as is the way. So what we found was that actually when we applied the patches, that most people felt some effect. There was 3 that felt no effect. But interestingly, and it did send me into a slight panic as a postgrad researcher training for my PhD, that all these people started to say they felt hot, and I thought I was investigating something that was supposed to cool you down. So it was a little bit of a stressful time for me. But we decided, well, it was what it was, and we would, don't preempt the science, follow it where it takes you. So we divided our sample accordingly. So the 3 that felt no sensation are excluded from this. But what you can see here on the figure is that on the on the y-axis, we've got the difference between the sensation in the right forearm and the sensation in the left forearm. And what we can see clearly is that we ended up with a group that felt hot and a group that felt cold. And the differences were significant, at least for the first 20 minutes. And then the variance starts to make it a little bit more murky. But certainly in that first 20 minutes, there's a very, very clear response from those who felt the menthol had a warming sensation and those who felt it had a cooling sensation. Now, this is probably interesting where we bring in, like I said, the methodology that we used, which was to soak a patch and then cover it over. And obviously, that would be potentially different depending upon whether we had sprayed the area, whether we had left the patch uncovered, so on and so forth. These aren't the first. At that time, they were the first, but these now aren't the first data to show that there's a warming effect, but it is not common that menthol has a warming effect. What's interesting here is that most papers don't report how they explain the study in the participant information sheet to their participants. So if the participants know that they are receiving a menthol intervention, it may be that they have a preconceived idea of what's happening, where we didn't tell our participants anything and we ended up having this sort of finding this heating effect. So what we did with our data then, we looked at the rest of it by splitting them into a warming group and a cooling group, those who found the menthol warming, and looked at their menthol trial and their control trial, and then the cooling group and looked at their menthol trial and their control trial. And we found no clear differences in any of the parameters we measured, but I've put here for you to see overall thermal sensation over the duration that we measured them, and overall thermal comfort. And I think what you can see is that there is obvious differences there between the warming and the cooling groups. But again, I think that at this point, we'd subdivided our data a lot more than we had planned to when we designed the study. And I think that at this point, it's underpowered, underpowered or has too many trials. As soon as you've got sort of 4 trials in there, it really reduces your statistical power. When we had 24 participants, and actually by this point we had 21 participants split between 2 groups. So instead of doing a within subjects design, we're doing a between subjects design. So it gets a bit complicated at this point, but fundamentally what we can say is that we saw no differences, and it perhaps is surprising. We may have genuinely expected to see a difference in heat storage, because as the menthol cools us down or gives us a cooling sensation, the body would have a physiological response to that would increase our heat storage. And the physiological response is that there would be a reduced cutaneous blood flow. And again, with our blood flow, with our laser Doppler, we saw no change in blood flow at the sites just distal to where the patches were applied. So the fact that some people felt a cooling sensation, some people felt a warming sensation, maybe opened up some questions to us about what would the effect of menthol on exercise be. So we then moved on and undertook this study where we took 12 males and we did a preliminary test to see what was the effect of the menthol application. And they then did a 60-minute preload, followed by a 20-minute time trial. Now, this environmental temperature is cooler than our resting study, but of course they're exercising, so it would have felt warm during the exercise. We applied the patches as per the previous trial with the addition of lower back patches. And again, we kept that left forearm patch always containing the placebo to allow that direct comparison. And what we've got then is when we split our participants into our 2 groups of 6, 6 that felt a warming sensation and 6 that felt a cooling sensation. Over the time trial, we've got a very clear difference between those that felt warming, which are in the dark squares, and those that felt a cooling sensation in the open blocks. So you can see there a clear difference between the groups over the time trial. And I don't know why the slide's not progressing, sorry. There we go. Okay. So what we then saw was that in the time trial, we've got here the work done during the time trial. In the time trial, they were given no feedback at all about their performance other than just duration left to go. What we can see then is over the cumulative work done that perhaps there's a tendency for the cooling group to do more work on the menthol trial than the control trial. But again, I think we're underpowered here to see a significant effect. And probably then, to bring this sort of heat and menthol section to a close, it's probably important, as with most interventions in exercise science, and particularly in elite sport, if we're thinking of using menthol as a cooling agent to aid sports performance, this is actually tested before you actually go into a competitive situation. Because if you happen to be working with an athlete who feels it is a warming sensation and you're trying to cool them down because they're exercising in a hot environment, that's not going to go down very well. So there's some food for thought about menthol, and it's quite an up-and-coming area. It's quite an interesting area as well. I think it is anyway. I appreciate I'm a bit of a geek with these things. Other things that I've been involved in over my time is some hydration work. We've published some papers on different rehydration drinks containing protein or not containing protein, that sort of thing. And most of those are now published and available. We've got a couple of ones that are not available. I'm going to tell you about one here, about hydration and cognitive function. So in exercise science, a lot of the time we look at hydration and cognitive function, and it's very difficult for us to separate the effects of the exercise from the cognitive function. So thinking about hydration, there's broadly two types of dehydration or hypohydration. There's exercise-induced hypohydration. That is where the participant becomes hypohydrated or more hypohydrated during the exercise. So it's not always the case that they start the exercise euhydrated. They may start hypohydrated and become more hypohydrated, but exercise induced. So that's basically water loss because of sweating. And then we've got pre-existing hyperhydration, and that could be chronic or acute hyperhydration. And so we often know usually that when we wake up in the morning, our first urination of the day is a lot more concentrated. And then as the day goes on, we become better hydrated usually. So that pre-existing hyperhydration could be where we start exercise hyperhydrated. So we undertook this study to try and tease out the differences in cognitive function, the changes that occur in cognitive function due to exercise versus the hydration, because most of the cognitive function and dehydration literature is done following exercise-induced dehydration. So then you've got the confounding factor of the exercise. There are some studies that look at long-term fluid restriction to induce dehydration, and there are other studies that use pharmacological agents to induce dehydration, but again, they come with their own difficulties. So in this study, we did a battery of cognitive function tests. So we did the Stroop test for executive function, we did the Sternberg test for working memory, and we did the visual search for visuomotor speed tests. They then went into the heat chamber and they intermittently cycled in the heat until they'd lost 1.8% of their body mass. So we weigh them, they cycled 10 minutes, rest for 5 minutes, cycle 10 minutes, rest for 5 minutes. Very hot, very humid conditions, 35 degrees C, 70% humidity. We don't want that sweat to be evaporating off them. We want the sweat to be dripping off them so that they're basically dehydrating reasonably quickly. So anywhere between 4 and 7 or 8 of those 10-minute stages would be required to lose about 1.8% of your body mass. They then either rehydrated overnight or they didn't. So on the rehydration trial, they were provided with 175% of what they had lost. On the dehydrated trial, on the trial where they remained hyperhydrated, they were provided with 200 mils of water. And they were also given some food, which is just dried food, so cereal bars and microwave pizzas. And then the next morning they came into the lab and they underdid the cognitive function tests again. And what we can see here very clearly is that there's a significant reduction in body mass due to the exercise. And you can see there it's a bit below, it's a bit greater than 2% reduction because it's 1.8% in the chamber. Then they continue sweating while they have a shower and so on and so forth. Then by the following morning, that body mass loss is continued in the hypohydrated trial, and the fluid we've provided is almost restored body mass in the rehydrated trial. And what we can see here from changes in plasma volume is that actually, although body mass loss is not fully compensated, plasma volume is back to baseline levels on the rehydrated trial and not on the hyperhydrated trial. So what did that show us? It showed us that mild degree of hyperhydration impaired the speed of visual perception in the test, but not the accuracy. So participants were still able to get the right answer, it just took them longer to get there. And so you can see that in the two figures here, where we've got a significant increase in the duration that it took for them to answer both the visual search basic level and the complex level when they were hypohydrated. No difference in attention tests or in working memory tests. Then moving on to hunger. So I'm really lucky to have been invited to work on a PhD studentship. This is not my student, and I'm not the sort of main supervisor of this, but it's really, really great work that a couple of my colleagues are doing, and I'm really honoured to be part of it. So we know that a lot of diets want us to control our calorie intake. You know, they dress it up in all different ways, but broadly speaking, it's about reducing calorie intake because that is the sort of fundamental calories in, calories out. One of these areas that's quite popular is the sort of time-restricted feeding, and whether that's the 5-2, so you have sort of 5 days where you're effectively dieting and then 2 days where you're eating very, very little, or whether it's time-restricted feeding where you're fasting for 16 hours and then you have an 8-hour window where you eat. I mean, it's still fundamentally the same thing of restricting your opportunity for consuming calories. But the problem with these diets is they do tend to make you quite hungry. So we then looked at the idea of placebo feeding. So how can you give someone or make someone think they've eaten something when they haven't? And so what they did is they get 14 males and they basically consumed either a water only. Now water is water, so there's no way you can hide that. So that's a control trial. Or a very low energy viscous placebo. So it's basically sort of like a thick, gloopy milkshake. The best thing I can liken it to is a McDonald's milkshake. It didn't taste quite as nice as that, but it's that sort of really thick consistency. Or a whole food breakfast. And again, they weren't told that the milkshake was low energy. They were just told that we're looking at different calorie modes of delivery. Subjects were blinded to the energy content and the study aims. And there, for those of you who are interested, are the details of the particular breakfasts. So they were given these breakfasts and then measured appetite, subjective appetite measures regularly, and then 3 and a bit hours later they were given a ad lib lunch where they basically self-served a lunch, and we measured how much they ate in that. They also took blood samples during that, but I'm not going to get into the physiology of that just now. So what did they find? So somewhat unsurprisingly, in the food trial where they had an actual breakfast and then self-served lunch, they had a much greater calorie intake than when they had the fake breakfast and self-served lunch, or when they had the water breakfast and self-served lunch. But what's really interesting is that actually the total area under the curve for hunger, for their desire to eat and for their prospective food consumption were all lower, and their perception of fullness was greater on the placebo and the food trials compared to the water trial. So that's suggesting that to us that this placebo feeding has worked really, really well in terms of controlling hunger such that they can lose weight and reduce calorie intake. So that might have massive implications for those people trying to undertake caloric restriction. I haven't got any data to show you on this. High performance, I sat and I thought I could talk to you about my supplement work. Most of that is published. I could talk to you about my serotonin transporter density work. It's probably a little bit too much to get into. So I thought for high performance, and I know you've got a lot of performance things, talks coming, I'm writing up some data just now on some athletes, sub-elite athletes who have just completed the Tour de France. So they do the Tour de France 1 week ahead of the professional athletes. And we've got data there on training history, workloads and power outputs for each day of the ride, in-ride and post-ride, nutrition, fluid intake, body mass, and so on. So we've got some loads of nice data. So we're just writing up a paper on that. And I'm just starting collecting data on another high performance exercise where we're going to look at the effect of cooling on exercise in the heat. So we're going to look at convective cooling and trying to mimic a genuine wind speed for the speed that this person is cycling, although they'll obviously be on a static bike. Because there's this classic work here from Galloway and Morn suggesting that optimal temperature for exercise is about 11 degrees C. But if you're actually cycling along in 11 degrees C at maybe circa 20 miles an hour, you actually have quite a lot of convective cooling. So we're going to have a look at that in a more ecologically valid setting. And then just to wind up with my main project just now is a student health study. And this is a massive project that we've launched. And basically it's looking at, is university good for you? So that's saying to us, what happens to students when they come through, and I say our doors, I work at Nottingham Trent, but I think hopefully we will scale this up to many universities. Who knows, at some point soon you might see this logo at Bedford. We have to talk about that in the future. But basically, is going to university good for you? In the short term, we've got around about 2.3 million students going to university. So that's a pretty big wedge of the population, coupled with the fact that there's something close to 50% of school leavers are now attending university. So if the long-term effects of university attendance on your health are not that good, that actually has massive economic implications going forward. There's some data, but it's all cross-sectional. So it's a snapshot in time of what is the circumstance at university for students now. And what we want to do is provide some longitudinal data. So we're looking at people in year 1 and following them through. At the moment, we're following through to year 3, but the idea would then be we'd contact them when they're 5 years post-undergraduate, 10 years post-undergraduate. But at the moment, we've just started. So we've compiled a health survey of validated questions, and we've sent that out. We started it somewhat unluckily. We started it in the start of the academic year 2019, so 2 years ago. And we sent it to about 10,000 students at NTU, and we got about 14 or 15% response rate. And that gave us 214 students that actually answered it multiple times in that year. In year 2, we sent it to 20,000 students and got again about 15% response rate. So we're starting to build up some responses for our survey, and obviously that's going to take some time. And this year we're going to be sending it to the entire university, so that'll be about 25,000 students this year. We're also trying to couple that with some actual health testing rather than just self-report through a survey. So we're doing measures of waist, height, hip and body mass. We're doing blood pressure, heart rate, grip strength and jump height for power and strength calculations. We've just launched measuring finger prick glycated hemoglobin to look at glucose handling. We're taking on some spirometry measures, and then we have ethical approval for, but don't have the infrastructure yet, to look at some markers of inflammation, potential for iron deficiency, and some cardiovascular function markers within the blood. And then we've also got, we're developing a method for looking at hair samples, where we'd snip a little bit of people's hair off and look at cortisol in their hair to try and look at stress levels. So in year 1, we invited people to the lab, but COVID happened and that whole thing got sort of kaput. Last year, again, we're still in a COVID times, but we took the opportunity to try and just assess our students within sports science. And we've got 150 students that we got longitudinal data for. So what did we find? Well, our baseline found that around 32% of students had clinically low well-being. 20% had high stress levels, and that was even just in the October. So that doesn't obviously take in any sort of changes around exam time. We were quite pleased, more than half were meeting moderate to vigorous physical activity guidelines, but nearly 3/4 were sedentary for more than 6 hours a day, and that's the sort of magic threshold that's been shown to negatively affect health. And only 10%, 11% were eating a healthy diet as indicated by fruit and veg intake. The impact of COVID, 23% decrease in the amount of physical activity, 6% decrease in mental well-being, 15% increase in stress, and 8% increase in sedentary behaviour. These data have formed 2 publications for us so far. And we've also got some data from last year in our sports science students showing that we've got a significant increase in BMI in just first year sports science students over that first sort of October to April. In females, that increase in BMI was associated with reduced physical activity levels, but that was no association for the male students. So that's a bit of a whistle-stop tour. And my thanks go to these various collaborators on these various projects, as well as many other collaborators over the years, hence why I've got such a diverse population of research. And then obviously sort of the reason that you do it, that keep you sane and also drive you insane are these lovely little weirdos down here that I've made. And then that's it really. So I'm open to any questions, but I do appreciate I ran over a little, sorry. So if I stop.
Hi Ruth, thanks for that. That was amazing. As you said, yeah, a little bit of an overrun. Hence why I always have a break after you, just so that we've got a little bit of leeway. So we have got some questions in the chat. If anyone wants to go and have a 5-minute break, they're more than welcome. I will just be having a chat with Ruth. So if you want to stay and go through some of the questions, then you can have a sit here as well. So I do have some questions, but I will go to the lovely audience first. So first up, we've got Mike. So Mike Newell is from University of Bedfordshire, and he says, the number of time points coupled with the different sensation levels and treatment gives a lot of degrees of freedom, making significance difficult to achieve, as you indicated.
Absolutely.
Did you perform any area under the curve assessments on these data sets to get a more holistic view of the response?
No, Mike is the answer. I did this data was collected about 15 years ago. So when I say that I've not published it yet, it's always on my back burner, and it's been really nice to actually get the opportunity to dig it back out and get back into it. And as I've got back into it, I'm sitting there thinking, I think I just didn't have a good enough grasp of statistical analytical techniques when I was doing my PhD to do anything other than the kind of basic stats that I did. So it's one of those that, absolutely, looking at area under the curve to see if we can get anything in those data sets is really good suggestion. So no, I haven't, and yes, I will.
But I think that's a really good point of showing that we do progress, and that's something I think the students will benefit from hearing as well. Of you're not always going to have the answers straight away, and I think
I don't have the answers still.
There we go. So it's okay not to have all the answers. And I think when you mentioned that as well during the presentation, you talked about the panic of not knowing what was happening with the science. It is fine to experience that, and sometimes supervisors will help, and sometimes they might not even know. So great answer for Mike there. So we've got Chris Tyler here as well. Says, thank you for talk, Ruth. Apologies if I missed it, but I was wondering, A, what was the mental control for that? And B, how effective do you think the control was? E.g., did you provide a similar tingling sensation, smell, irritation, brackets, just minus the menthol? We've done some menthol work, and this part of the design is always a nightmare. Thanks, Chris.
I completely agree. So I used a mix of methylated spirits and water, and that was used to dissolve our 1% menthol crystals. And then for the control, or the placebo, we used just the methylated spirits and water, so it gave it the same weird purple look, and the same sort of quite pungent smell. So it masks that sort of vaporish smell that you get from the menthol, minty smell. But we didn't get anybody sort of flagging the difference between the left forearm and the right forearm, that they noticed the fact that that was the placebo on the menthol trial.
Yeah.
I'm not sure I'm answering that very clearly, but where we kept on the menthol trial, we kept the left forearm as the placebo, and we didn't get anyone saying sort of, although they did obviously experience thermal differences, we didn't get anyone saying this one hurts and this one doesn't or anything like that. So I don't have any data to back that up, but I would say it was okay. And like I said, with using the methylated spirits, that helped with the obvious difference in smell.
Yeah, no one sort of said, oh, hang on a minute, you've not put it on. So
yeah.
Good.
So yes, but I think you're right, Chris, on that one. Yeah, it's very difficult. You know, as with a lot of things now, you know, I've been involved in some of my husband's hydration work, and it's the whole idea of, well, how do you blind someone to the fact that they're drinking? And it's the same with that placebo feeding. If you've really got to have a robust control or placebo, whichever you choose to use, to be able to actually draw any sort of conclusions from your data, really. So yes, I completely agree. It's a problem in that area of research, in the same as several areas.
Brilliant. Chris says thanks for that, and so does Mike. Julia's got a question saying, really interesting presentation, Ruth. Regarding menthol, do you have any ideas of why some individuals perceive a warm versus cold sensation? No. I'll let you do that one, and then she's got another question for the appetite study.
Yeah, the answer honestly on that one is no. This was sort of the end of my PhD, and I think perhaps if I'd gone straight into you know, an independent research fellow position or straight into an academic position, I would have continued down the menthol route. But after my PhD, these were the last 2 studies of the PhD. After that, I did a 3-year postdoc doing some work for the military, and then working with Craig Sale. So we did a lot of supplementation, and then with the military we did sort of cold injury stuff. So I never got a chance to sort of continue down that, as to find out why did some people perceive it as warming versus cooling. And even possibly would have been interesting to do that sort of study with and just find out, like now there's sort of, the literature suggests that actually you just administer it right near the end of an exercise performance or capacity bout, and that might be more effective than administering it before or during, or, you know, so that would be interesting. But I didn't continue down that, so I have no idea why some people do and some people don't.
There we go. Oh, Julia's given a thumbs up, so she's happy with that. I've got one quick part of Julia's question, if I can have a quick answer, and then we're going to jump into Ash's presentation. So second part to Julia was, in the appetite study, have you looked into the additives or unnatural products that made up the placebo? I assume there were some sweeteners, etc. Really interesting study. Also, was it palatable for the participants?
It was xanthine gum with aspartame, so it was sweetened, and it was, so the xanthine gum is what gave it the thick gloopiness. Was it palatable? Well, probably not as nice as the food breakfast, which was like toast and jam, but certainly, I mean, there would be no point in doing it if it was so revolting that people wouldn't go down that route. So it was certainly plenty nice enough, though you perhaps, you know, it's one of those you wouldn't choose it. But then, to be honest, I wouldn't choose a McDonald's milkshake. So to me, no, it wasn't. But it wasn't. Nobody had a problem consuming it.
It wasn't nice, but it wasn't disgusting. There's somewhere in the middle.
I've made people eat a lot worse. Namely my husband most evenings.
Right, thanks for that. If they've got any more questions, please put them in the chat, and I will put them to Ruth and get her to give us some lovely responses. I've got some questions, just generic ones, that I'll get her to put some answers out for, because everyone is really interested in your chat today, and I should have given you a lot longer.
I know, I'm so sorry I went over. Sorry, everybody.
That's all right. So we have skipped our little break. I did plan it there for a certain reason. But we are now going to go to Ash Beckett, who is one of our PhD candidates at the University of Bedfordshire, and he's going to follow on in the regards to heat. And Ash, if you're ready, can you just share your slides? And we will start with your presentation. So we've got 10 minutes for Ash, followed by Jake and Jack, who are also other PhD candidates at the University of Bedfordshire. And then we're going to have all their questions and answers sessions at 11:10. So if you've got any questions, please put them in the chat and we'll deal with them all in one go. So Ash, if you're ready, then over to you.
You can see my screen all right, yeah?
Yeah, I can.
Cool. So yeah, thank you for having me. My name's Ashley Beckett. I'm a full-time PhD student here at the University of Bedfordshire, currently going into my second year. And this is a quick overview of my first study in my PhD thesis, looking at, we're doing a systematic review and meta-analysis, looking at the prevalence and influences of metabolic syndrome in firefighters. So common sense would tell us that firefighting is probably naturally a dangerous occupation. And when we look at this figure here, we can see that the nature of on-duty deaths in firefighters in 2020 are things that we might expect. So things like internal trauma, burns, stroke, asphyxia, etc. When in fact, cardiovascular disease is by far the leading cause of firefighter on-duty death, at about 46%. So that then begs the question, you know, what's the cause of such a high prevalence of cardiovascular disease death? So are firefighters physically meeting the demands of their occupation? Are they fire fit? So in the UK specifically, we've seen a 5% increase in overweight and obesity from 2008 to 2013. And when we plot that on this graph here, so I'm just going to move this out of the way. When we plot that on this graph here, we can see that healthy firefighters has naturally slowly decreased from about 35 to 30%. Overweight has slightly increased from about 52 to 54%. And then obviously obesity has increased from about 11 to 15%. And then the combination of overweight and obesity has risen from about 61 to 66%. Now, this is comparable to the general population, but firefighters carry a responsibility to be able to serve the general population, specifically, obviously, in those emergency situations. And it's been shown that obese firefighters are 5 times more likely to miss work days due to things like injury and illnesses. So clearly, they're not able to meet the occupational demands. Now, in the UK, primarily, the research has been classifying health in firefighters by the use of BMI, and obviously that comes with limitations as well, things like misclassification, etc. So in my PhD thesis, we're going to focus on the metabolic syndrome, which could be argued is a more comprehensive diagnosis of health. And it's quite relevant for firefighters in particular because it focuses on a cluster of cardiovascular disease risk factors. It's been argued it's a more significant risk factor for the onset of cardiovascular disease rather than obesity alone. And if we look at this figure on the right, we can see that it encompasses raised fasting glucose levels, low HDL levels, elevated triglycerides, elevated waist circumference, and also high blood pressure as well. And if we was going to diagnose someone, if they screened positive for 3 out of the 5 criteria, typically we would then diagnose them with metabolic syndrome. It's been estimated that the global prevalence of metabolic syndrome is around 1/4 of the world population, which equates to just over 1 billion of the world population. And it's also been suggested that firefighters may be at a greater risk of developing metabolic syndrome. And of course, firefighters are required to provide their service 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And that requires them to work a variety of shift patterns as well. And then that can lead to things like poor sleep quality, poor food choices, increased nocturnal eating, and a decrease in voluntary physical activity as well. So when we look at this figure on the right, obviously we can't do much about the things here. So genetics, epigenetics, things like age. We know metabolic syndrome increases with age, but we can't do anything about that. But what we can do is look at the lifestyle and environmental factors, like I said, things like obesity, poor nutrition, inactivity. And if we can highlight these areas here and reduce metabolic syndrome prevalence at the start, then we can hopefully reduce the onset of cardiovascular disease later down the line. So with that in mind, our research questions and aims. So our research question was to find out what is the prevalence of and influences of metabolic syndrome in firefighters. And in line with that, we wanted to provide a reliable estimate of the prevalence of metabolic syndrome and to identify and assess the influences of metabolic syndrome as well. And it's probably quite a relevant cartoon, probably me as the researcher telling them to start listening and probably facing some obstacles along the way, but we'll find out. So current stages, this is an overview of the Prisma diagram. So shout out to Jake Scott with helping me. So we've gone through the title screening, abstract screening, and full text screening. We've now got down to 22 final studies selected for analysis. We've completed the risk of bias and almost just in the final stages of finishing data extraction as well. So up next, we're going to do a meta-analysis of the pooled prevalence. Hang on. Oh yeah, and then we're going to write up and we're going to publish. If only it was that simple. Obviously, that's best case scenario. We're probably going to have multiple drafts and multiple rewrites in that time, but that's best case scenario. So current findings, just from the data extraction that we've done so far, we found no current data of metabolic syndrome in UK firefighters and limited data in the behaviours that influence metabolic syndrome as well. Hang on. So yeah, later chapters in the thesis will address this. Positive change starts with you. Thought that was quite relevant. But what we have found that is of quite significant so far is that Mediterranean diet adherence is associated with a lower prevalence of metabolic syndrome in firefighters. So nice, happy, healthy firefighter here. And improved cardiorespiratory fitness is also associated with a lower prevalence of metabolic syndrome as well. And again, that's typical for the general population, not just firefighters as well. And lastly, we found that prevalence rates vary quite a bit between geographical location. And again, that's the same, the figure here showing obesity across the world has quite a lot of fluctuation between geographical location as well. So this is a bit of preliminary data, but please note that what I'm about to show you is sort of just for today, and it's just sort of for discussion points only. So got a forest plot here, highlighting the prevalence of metabolic syndrome. And we can see, total participants so far in the meta-analysis is around 30,104. And that highlighted square there shows that's the estimated total pooled prevalence. So about 19% across all the studies that we've looked at so far. But of course, there's quite a big disparity in there as well. So the lowest prevalence rate about 9% and the highest about 46%. So that's obviously naturally led to high heterogeneity within the studies. And that could be down to a number of things. So metabolic syndrome diagnostic criteria, obviously there's quite a few. So there's NCEP, ATP3, IDF, World Health Organization, EGIR, and the Joint Scientific Statement that we found have been used in the study so far. Sample size, so smallest study reports 47, whereas the largest sort of national survey study reported 6,947. Again, like I mentioned, geographical location as well. Most of the studies have come out of the USA, handful in Germany, a few in Iran, and one in Canada. And also age of participants as well. So going back to the epigenetic side of metabolic syndrome. So the lowest average age of the studies, so the lowest age was 37, and the highest mean age in one of the studies was 50. So we're going to complete a subgroup analysis and meta-regressions to explore this heterogeneity, but that's to be completed. But overall, the idea of this systematic review and meta-analysis is give us a clearer direction for future research. This is a little graphic of probably me, Jeff, and Angel, my supervisory team, trying to build the foundation of my PhD thesis. So hopefully with this, we can identify gaps in the current literature. We can then highlight the most appropriate methodology to use going forward. And then, of course, we can address the gaps and contribute novel findings to the literature as well. But most importantly, probably, and the backbone of this research is to hopefully improve and inform policy on how to improve and optimize firefighter occupational health. So we can have a nice situation like this where he wants to be like that in a year's time, and we can obviously help him get there with scientifically backed research. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ash. That was really interesting and really impactful data that it looks like is going to come out of that. So that's really exciting to see what you're going to be presenting next year as well. So if you've got any questions for that, please put them into the chat, and then we'll address them all in a few minutes' time. As he gave a shout out already, we're going to move on to Jake Scott's presentation now. So Jake's loading up his screen. Again, if you've got any questions, please put them in the chat and we can deal with these all in a few minutes. Okay, Jake, if you're ready.
Yes, so hello all, thank you Ash for that shout out, and thank you for ISPAR today for inviting me to speak. I'm currently a PhD candidate here at ISPAR and have been for a year now. And today I'm going to discuss my second study for my PhD, which is titled The Perceptions and Usages of Cooling Modalities in Endurance and Intermittent Sports in the Heat. So if we take a look at the pictures down below, these are topical in relation to the title. So here we have the Tokyo Olympic Games. In the middle, we have the Tour de France. And on the right, we have the European Championships this summer, which are the first cooling break in its tournament history. So as we know, when athletes get hot, their performance capacity seems to reduce. And therefore, the cooling modalities on show potentially were an appropriate tool to manage exercise-induced hypothermia. So firstly, firstly, I would like to define what cooling actually is. So it's a technique applied to either externally or internally to the body in an attempt to reduce heat strain. Either an ice slurry ingestion, cold water ingestion, or like what Ruth said, either menthol mouth rinse potentially. So when can we apply this? Well, we can apply it in 3 different scenarios: either pre-cooling before an event, per/mid-cooling during an event, or post-cooling after an event. And then where can we apply this? Well, typically we apply it in a hot environment where the cooling stimulus can be greater. And then where in terms of the environment? Well, it could be either pitch side or in a change room where we can gain access to potentially aircon, which can improve the cooling stimulus. And then in terms of the exercise duration, can we do it either at the beginning of the game, in the middle at half time, or at the end of an event? And then who can take advantage of this? Well, athletes, spectators, and officials can all take advantage of cooling. And then how do we apply it? Well, we apply it either externally to the skin or internally as a cold fluid ingestion, or either the mixed method of these two. And then the main question is why? Well, why do we use cooling? Potentially to improve performance. If we can get athletes feeling better or feeling cooler, potentially they can perform at great intensity for longer. And then on the flip side, potentially it can minimize injury or illness. So previous studies have looked at cooling usages within an endurance cohort. So Perriard and studies and colleagues, in 2015 looked at the World Championships, where out of 307 athletes, 52% pre-cooled. And then in 2016, in a smaller cycling cohort, out of 69 athletes, 96% pre-cooled. And therefore, there was an improvement over time. However, this looks at a very small cohort in terms of an international based and endurance based. So we are therefore going to look more at a team sport-based environment. So what we aim to do was look at more of a larger and broader and global scale cohort to understand the usages and also the perceptions and knowledge of cooling modalities by both, again, intermittent endurance-based athletes, coaches, or support staff. We added coaching and support staff, whereas the previous two didn't. And we look to impact the decision-making of all these individuals in the future. And as we can see here below, potentially all the different cooling modalities may be on show. So onto the methodologies now. We use the cohort study design, which is in a yearly cycle. We're currently in we started in February this year, sorry, and it's currently halfway through the cycle. And today there's an active QR code that can be used. And if anyone could complete this, that'd be much appreciated. So as stated in the aim, any leveled at 18 to 65-year-old athlete, coach, or practitioner who had trained or competed or coached in the heat could take part. Is a heat stress prevention and cooling modality questionnaire with 44 to 45 questions, lasting roughly about 15 to 20 minutes long, with closed question answers. And the question breakdown is here below. What we found was that there was 167 responses, with 119 males and 48 females, with the age of roughly with an average of 31. And the recruitment rate was 61%, with an average time of 20 minutes. And the support breakdown is here within table 1. And I'm only going to talk today about the whole cohort, as I haven't got time to go into the different sports. So mainly the cohort resided in the UK, with a few from the US and Australia. And I'm happily surprised that we got out of the cohort, there was 45% who were international and national level coaches or athletes. And also I was happily surprised that we got a few Olympic medalists and managed to get the questionnaire actually in the Olympic Village at the time. So onto the main findings. Well, across the x-axis in this figure here is the occurrence of heat or competition in the heat. And then along the y-axis is the number of responses. So if we focus on the highest column here, which is the less often category of occurrence in heat, well, this is unsurprising as most of the athletes reside in the UK. However, it's important to pinpoint here that occasional events, potentially if they travel abroad, that preparation is key in terms of cooling, and the heat could be debilitating towards these individuals. So if you move over to this figure now, this looks at the timing of cooling. And also if we link these two figures together, that there were 16 that never had competed in the heat, whereas 46 had suggested that there was no cooling on show, that they'd never used cooling. So potentially there's 30 people here that are ill prepared to compete in the heat, which is alarming. And then out of the pre and per cooling, only 31 to 32% actually use some sort of pre-cooling or per cooling, which is alarming too. So onto the most popular cooling. Well, unsurprisingly, cold water ingestion is the most popular, as it's the most accessible and easy to use. This was the most popular in pre and per cooling, and to a great extent for post cooling. And this was supported by a meta-analysis where it showed that if we use cold water ingestion prior to an event, it can improve performance by 4%. And then during an event, it can improve performance by 5%. And we can see here that there were other methods that improve performance at a great extent. However, this cold water ingestion seems to be the most practical for a field-based an event. So if we move over to the perceptions of what we found during the questionnaire, well, on the x-axis here is how much an individual actually agreed or disagreed with the with a certain statement. So along the y-axis there, it's the response percentage. So out of the coaches, 43% strongly agreed with a pre-cooling improves physical performance in the heat. whereas only 10% of athletes actually stated this. And then if we go to figure B here, this was a statement about cooling during exercise improves physical performance in the heat. And 35% of coaches and practitioners strongly agreed with this, whereas 20% of athletes agreed with this. So there seems some uncertainty around about athletes in the benefits around cooling. So there may be a knowledge gap or translation of knowledge issue here. So on to the final slide of implications. So even though we've only looked at a few responses here, the questionnaire looks to inform, educate, direct, and prepare. As we've seen that a lot of athletes are frequently exposed to a wide range of environments, and specifically hot environments, and this is only going to increase in the future due to climate change. And as I stated, potentially some of these athletes are ill prepared to compete in the heat, which is alarming. Cold water ingestion is the most popular, and the timing of cooling is the most use is in post-cooling, whereas only 31 to 32% actually use some pre or per cooling. And all of this can direct our future research. So it's very much an athlete-driven topic of research, where what we find in this questionnaire could direct what we do in the laboratories. And also in terms of education, this questionnaire looks to narrow the gap between that translation of knowledge from the coach to athlete. Upon analysis, we're going to create posters to hopefully educate the use of cooling modalities in the future. And then the final point here is, I just wanted to highlight that if in terms of a greater level, if there's a greater level of athlete, they potentially have a more accessibility to cooling, and therefore a greater exposure and potentially a greater exposure to heat all round, so therefore they're prepared. However, if we look at the flip side of a low level athlete, they may not have a greater accessibility to cooling, but they may be exposed to heat all round. So these might be more at risk. So to conclude, it's likely that you're definitely going to see more cooling in the future in global events. And yeah, don't be surprised to see the potential increase of these being beneficial in the future, especially due to climate change. So I'd like to acknowledge my Director of Studies, Dr. Jeffery Aldous, and my external supervisors, Dr. Chris Tyler at the University of Southampton, and Ralph Gordon and Emily Balsford for the organisation of this study. And thank you for listening. I'll take any questions, and the QR code is active now, so if anyone can take part, that'd be much appreciated. So thank you.
Thanks, Jake. That was really interesting and obviously very, very topical. So that's really nice. We're just going to jump into Jack's presentation. So Jack's got a 5-minute presentation, and then we are going to do 5-minute break, and we'll get restarted again at past. So we're going to do Jack's and some questions next. So if Jack's just started sharing his screen, that's lovely. So again, just put all your comments into the chat, and we'll address them in a few minutes.
Right, so I'm definitely sharing this time, aren't I?
Yeah, all working.
Right, okay. So hi, I'm Jack Griffiths, and I'm studying what the effect, in our systematic review, I'll be studying the effect of hot and cold hypoxic environments on both cognitive function and physical performance during intermittent exercise in healthy males and females in team sports. So in terms of physical performance, it has been shown to be influenced when performing in extreme environments, and this is essential in team sports due to the variation in low intensity and high intensity exercise, and this has been shown to be affected in either through issues with heat storage or oxygen saturation, or exercise-induced asthma in terms of cold conditions, hypoxic conditions, and hot conditions. In terms of cognitive performance as well, it's also been highlighted to reduce cognitive function in terms of decision making and accuracy in these in these team sports, and this is also essential because cognitive performance, decision making, it allows you to react to the stimuli around you and then perform the correct movements to either stop or progress movement in these games. So in terms of the rationale, we've been looking at the Donham paper as they looked through and used team sport athletes in hot environments to assess their cognitive performance, where we are progressing that and looking in cold and hypoxic environments, as they have been shown to be environments that occur with team sport athletes. And particularly a limitation of their paper was using exercise-specific cognitive function tests during these exercises as well. So the aim of the systematic review is to highlight the need for future research and quantify any detriments to cognitive function and physical performance that exist within these environments, and is hypothesized that that a discrepancy will be shown between the number of physical performance papers compared to the cognitive function papers in the literature. So just in terms of the methods, just looking through electronic databases such as PubMed, Web Science, etc., just to identify relevant studies, and then identifying titles and abstracts that identify studies using inclusion criteria and exclusion criteria, and then producing a Prisma flow diagram to represent these studies. And then progressing on further using the grade tool to assess the quality of these studies, and then the selection bias through a 6-point Cochrane collaboration, and then finally producing a funnel plot to assess the publication bias as well. And progress as of now, so ethical approval was obtained on the 6th of June in 2021, and initial search of the study is being completed as of right now in September 21. We have identified 8,023 studies as of right now, and just screening those papers to obtain the inclusion criteria papers that we require. So that's just my systematic review. If there's any questions, you can type them in the chat or just email me at my email.
Brilliant, Jack. Thank you. That was really interesting and really topical, and they all linked really nicely together. So well done, team, for that one. So if all three of you are available, we've got a few questions just coming up in the chat. So a number of people saying great presentations, so well done. Definitely have a look at the chat so you can see them as well. So this one's for Ash from Lisa Hughes. Says great presentation, Ash, and just one question / observation about the age parameter of your studies, with 50 being the max age for your case studies. PS, Lisa is 51, so just be careful what you say, and just wondering if there's a reason why you've got this max age of 50.
I got Gideon already replied in the chat, but essentially that when I showed the mean age figures there, it was essentially the lowest age that we found in the firefighter cohort in the studies that we found. So that was 37 versus 50 years old. So obviously if we're comparing those two groups, we might get quite a bit of bias within the results. That's why we're going to explore that heterogeneity. In terms of our actual limits on age, we was going from 18 to 65 years old. So that was the range that we could actually pick out in our data extraction.
Lovely. Oh, I've got another one just popped up from Julia. So question for Ash as well. Not all firefighters will engage in the same behaviours that cause MS. Have you thought at all about targeting certain behaviours applicable to the individual level?
So that's sort of the focus of study 2, which is going to focus on a questionnaire. We're going to sort of set out different health behaviour questionnaires, so things like physical activity, sleep, nutritional habits. But importantly, what we're also going to do, big thanks to Angel for this one, is leave an open text box at the end that's going to sort of give us some qualitative insight into the specifics of what firefighters themselves are going to report back to us, what behaviours they're going to report that might influence that as well.
Lovely. Smiley face from Angel, I think, there. So she's happy with that one. Brilliant. I haven't got, oh no, I've got one more. Jake, could the fact that the post-calling could the fact that post-cooling was the most used cooling modality was a result of it being used for recovery rather than cooling? Great presentation. I think that's
we added this due to the fact just to get the range of cooling actually on show. It's great to see that that's using post-cooling, and like the stereotype is that most cooling is used after an event, but now we really want to direct this research towards pre and during cooling. So it's not surprising that this post-cooling is the highest. I don't know if that answers the question, but
yeah, no, I think that one's good. Ruth says great work for postgraduates, so well done. And it's just interesting, obviously, having Ruth's presentation, it's like we planned it, just before yours, of how menthol could be used as one of those cooling. But then if it was, as Ruth was saying, actually sensation might be the opposite to what you actually want. So if you see that athletes are using that, it's interesting to note they might not actually be getting the effect they were expecting or should have, or
absolutely. Ruth explained it really well, how it's very individual. If it's working for a certain athlete, like we've seen in the questionnaire, it's working for them perceptually, then they'll carry on to use this. Or there's loads of different methods that we can use to actually cool someone down. So there's other methods available.
No, that's fab. Right, so we're a minute early, so well done team for keeping us on time. So we are going to have a 10-minute break now. So if everyone can get back for 11:30, if you do have any additional questions, please put them in the chat and we'll get them to the right people. And if you need anything else, then please let me know. But I will see you all back here at 11:30 for the next half. 12:30. Everyone should be making their way back from their little break and hopefully got a nice cup of tea or coffee. And we're going to start this session with Diana, our lovely PhD student. So Diana, whenever you're ready, do you want to start sharing your screen? Lovely. And same as before, if you've got any questions, please put them all in the chat, and then we'll wait until all 4 students have presented with our Q&A at 12:05. Okay, so whenever you're ready, your slides are sharing, so it's over to you.
Hi everyone. So today I'll be presenting results from my second study of my PhD. And it's the first study to go into this level of detail regarding the absolute validity of central pressure variables in this population. So this study is called Intra and Intersessionability of central pressure measures in healthy older adults during bipedal static postural control tests. So just to give you a little bit of context, central pressure represents body motion in space and is used to quantify postural stability. So the intrinsic variability of central pressure measures, sampling duration, and number of trials may affect their ability and validity of postural stability outcomes. So although previous studies have indicated how many trials and trial time are needed to obtain good reliability in several COP measures in older adults, sampling duration range from 30 to 120 seconds and number of trials from 3 to 9 were not indicated. So we can see there is no consensus regarding trial number and duration or even testing conditions. So considering that COP has an intrinsic variability and sway increases with advanced age, it is important that the results obtained from measuring postural stability in older adults to be due to the actual changes in the postural sway as opposed to random or systematic errors during the testing sessions. As such, the aim of this study was to investigate the intra and intersessionability of 9 COP variables to determine the number of trials and time needed to obtain an acceptable coefficient of variance during a bipedal static postural test in older adults. So we tested 11 community well older adults. The exclusion criteria was quite extent, but in here we have a few examples, and all participants came to our labs twice. So here we can see a schematic of the data collection. So each participant performed a bipedal static postural test with eyes open and eyes closed, and this was done in a random way. They stood barefoot on a force plate as still as possible, feet width apart, arms hanging by their sides, and they completed 5 30-second trials with eyes open and eyes closed, so 10 tries in total. They had 1 minute seated rest between trials, and consistent foot placement was ensured between trials. While they were doing this test, they were required to look to a black X mark on a whiteboard that was 2 meters from the force plate. So on this slide, we can see how the testing procedures were done. So as I said, they completed 5 trials, either with eyes open or eyes closed, so 10 in total. Then they had 1 hour of seated rest before the next session. During this hour, they were only allowed to use the loo, and they were required to sit during the entire time. Then, to measure intersessionability, they came to our uni on the following week at the same time to measure the intersessionability. So when I say on the following week, so for example, if they were tested on a Monday, they would also be testing on the following week on the same day in the morning, for example. So in terms of data analysis, so we used Microsoft Excel to calculate the 9 COP variables. So for instance, sway path, mean speed, maximum speed, etc. And we also use SPSS for normality testing and detection of outliers. The COP variables were analyzed over 10, 15, 20, 25, and 30 seconds. So although we collected the 30 seconds, we analyzed over these time intervals. Means and standard deviations for each sampling duration were obtained by averaging 3, 4, and 5 trials. And we use the coefficient of variance to estimate intra and intersessionability. So our results. So as we can see in here, so on the left side, we have the results for eyes open. On the right side, we have the results for eyes closed. In green, we have the coefficient of variance below 20%. So overall, for all COP variables in both eyes open and eyes closed, an acceptable intersessionability was found, but not intercession. So only sway path, mean speed, anterior posterior, and medial lateral mean velocity presented an acceptable intra and intersessionability when 3 trials of 10 seconds were average. So I'm afraid that this is just part of the results, and this table refers to analysis over 10 seconds. The other thing that we found was that as more trials were analyzed, the data either slightly decreased or the data plateau. So this is another example. So in here we now have analysis at 30 seconds. So as more time was analyzed, the coefficient of variance decreased. So for example, in here we have anterior posterior mean velocity. And again, the coefficient of variance decreased. And as more trials were analyzed, it either, the data again, either plateau or just decrease marginally. So which in terms of reliability, it's even better. So our conclusion. So we conclude that 3 trials of 10 seconds were sufficient to obtain good intra and intersessionability in sweep path, mean speed, anterior posterior, and medial lateral mean velocity in both eyes open and eyes closed conditions. So although previous studies indicated 3 seconds were sufficient, we can see that 10 seconds were actually sufficient, but then as more time was analyzed, the coefficient of variance decreased. Previous studies indicated that COP mean velocity was one of the most reliable COP variables to detect changes in other adults. So we found out the same, but also found that other variables were also reliable. And one of the aspects that need to be mentioned is that statistical analysis, so the statistical analysis that the studies use to analyze the results may impact their reliability results and may lead to different interpretations of the results. So this is an aspect that needs to be taken into account. The other aspect that needs to be taken into account is that the number of trials and visual conditions may impact the reliability of the results. And the fact that we found different results may also be to the fact that the participants may not be familiar to stand barefoot for 30 seconds without moving. So we need to further investigate to explain the differences of some COP variables in terms of reliability. Thank you so much.
Amazing. Thank you. That was really, really interesting. So if you've got any questions for Diana, please stick them in the chat and we can have them at 12:05. Up next, we've got Cheryl Barford, who not only is a PhD candidate, very, very, I think have we submitted corrections yet? We are very close to using the doctor word, is also a member of staff here at the University of Bedfordshire as well. So Cheryl, whenever you're ready, it's over to you.
Thank you. Okay, thanks very much everyone for the opportunity today to present a little section of my PhD, which is, as Rebecca just said, finished and passed actually. Yay! This section is looking at the torso muscle onset in response to an unexpected lower body perturbation in younger and older adults. So we know that the cost of falling in older adults is quite extreme at 2.3 billion per year estimated, and we know that people over the age of 80 are at least 50% risk of falling, and over the age of 65 30%. So as we are hopefully a population who are getting older, and more of us are actually getting older, this cost is only set to rise. The risks of falls tend to focus on intrinsic or extrinsic factors and usually try to mitigate the risk of falling. So I'm going to focus on the intrinsic factors, which would be something like the medications that an individual might be on, their peripheral limb control, muscle weakness, muscle strength, musculoskeletal condition, and of course what I'm focusing on, which is neuromuscular control. Lots of studies that I've looked at maybe the lower limb, in terms of strategies to try and regain posture when you might be prone to falling, but very few have looked at the torso muscles. So the aims of the study were not just to identify the differences between young and older adults when there's a propensity to slip in a lower body perturbation, but we had to create a device that would deliver that lower body perturbation and develop a test that could look at a few different torso muscles. So, for example, through extensive literature searches, I established that the transverse abdominis, internal oblique, external oblique, lumbar multifidus, and the erector spinae longissimus in this case were of particular focus. So I wanted to sort of focus in on those to see what happens, when do they activate, are there differences, do the deeper structures activate first, is there any sort of messaging system, or is it just a co-activation, everything switches on in order to try and create some sort of strategy to prevent the individual from falling when they don't know something is going to happen. So lots of researchers looked at multiple slip trials, but in everyday life we don't know that a slip is about to happen. So keeping the ecological validity of ensuring that things were as unexpected as possible was something I was keen to keep in. Now, so with this particular study, it was an independent between groups. I wanted to compare older and younger participants, which I managed to recruit 16 older and 25 younger. We were looking at the transverse abdominis, right side only, internal oblique, right side only, but we looked at bilateral, external oblique, lumbar multifidus, and erector spinae. Put a few extra measures in for the older population to make sure that they were not sarcopenic, in other words, at increased risk of fall. And also grip strength, which are two markers that are used to identify risk of falling. So if they did present as a risk of sarcopenic presence, then I was going to exclude them. Fortunately, none were, as you can see from the table here. So the age quite different. Interestingly, we used the IPAC questionnaire, the International Physical Activity Questionnaire, to identify how active the individuals were, and they were actually not too dissimilar. They were quite similar. BMI fairly similar as well, but the subcutaneous fat, which we used through one of our measurement methods, was actually quite different, which is important when we think about EMG. Now, to measure onset, this is where it gets interesting and a little bit funky. To get to the deeper tissue structures, traditional methods tend to use EMGs, electromyography, and would use fine wire for deeper tissue structures, and then surface for superficial muscle structures. It can be invasive, it can come with risk of infection. So we wanted to use a new novel method, which is using ultrasound. So we used ultrasound to measure the transverse abdominis, internal oblique, and the external oblique, which I'll explain in a little bit more detail. We used the linear transducer, which we placed on the anterior aspect of the abdomen to capture right side only. And the probe placement was standardized so that we could capture the same image time and time again for every single participant. And my measurement methods were then going to be as reliable as possible. Now, move on to the next one. So we also used to capture the superficial muscle structures, multifidus, erector spinae, and erector and external oblique. We used surface EMG, and through So we use surface EMG at the same time as capturing images for the ultrasound. In the ultrasound, that's what I wanted to say, we used motion mode, which is the aspect of ultrasound where when you place it onto the skin, you capture all of the underlying structures like a credit card slice, and that'll become more apparent when I show you a slide that's just about to come up. But it means that you can capture things in real time, and because we wanted to capture a dynamic event, then ultrasound and EMG were able to do that. But we needed to synchronize that and orchestrate that using motion capture. So the motion capture markers that you can see on the perturbation device down on the right hand side here, and I'm just about to show you how that perturbation is received by the participants quite differently in the two here. We put the markers on the perturbation device so that it could pick up the instant that there was movement, and it was from that point that we then tried to ascertain the muscle onset of the structures that I've just described. And the reaction of this particular participant is quite different to the previous, as you'll see in just a second. So it created sort of an unexpected event. Now the setup was quite different to that, because the participants didn't see any of the researchers when they were releasing the clip for the perturbation. As a seasoned EMG users will know, signal processing methods to get accurate information from the EMG measures is really, really important. And it was important because we had an older population where sometimes the underlying structures can create a little bit more noise on the signal. So I wanted to be as accurate as I possibly could because we had to synchronize those methods together as well. So exploration of the literature led me to implement something called the Tiger-Kaiser energy operator within the signal processing methods, which if you can tell the difference from figure 9 and 10, just allowed the signal to be much clearer and cleaner, so that when we implemented the algorithm to detect muscle onset, it was much more accurate. And there's an entire chapter dedicated to just that process. So that meant that when I could establish the external oblique, right side particularly, onset, it meant that I could determine levels of agreement between EMG, surface EMG, and the motion, the M-mode ultrasound measurements, where I was detecting tissue deformation, because obviously the inherent differences are, in ultrasound, you're looking for tissues that are moving, whereas in EMG, you're looking for changes in electrical activity. And also the two pieces of equipment collect information at different frequencies. So there is going to be obvious area, and I wanted to quantify that. So we used a 10 millisecond pulse wave that went at the same, that delivered a time pulse signal to the ECG module. If you can see in the bottom left-hand side image, there are those little bumps are the 10 millisecond pulse waves being delivered through the ECG module of the ultrasound, which meant that I could exactly nail when the perturbation was being delivered. And then using the calipers and the MindRay software, I was then able to determine when the tissues here, from the top line down to the bottom line of that M-mode image on the right-hand side, the orangey looking picture, when those tissues started to move. The top structure being the external oblique, the middle thicker structure being the internal oblique, and the underlying structure being the transversus abdominis. Transversus abdominis and the internal oblique tended to be quite similar. So in order to find the agreement between how close the onset were for EMG and ultrasound were going to be, I used Bland-Altman plots and determined the limits of agreement, which then using the mean differences, 4.45 milliseconds in the older adult population and minus 9.65 in the younger adult population. It means that ultrasound ultimately was coming in slightly slower for the older population and faster for the younger population. Sorry, the other way around. So, but basically we added that to the EMG figures for erector spinae and lumbar multifidus, so that we could make an accurate comparison across all of the muscles, which then allowed us to compare the muscle onset. So we used a 2x9 ANOVA to determine the differences between older and younger, the two different groups, and the 9 different muscles. Remember, there were only 3 on the ultrasound because it was only right side. So we did, surprise, surprise, find significant differences in muscle onset between older and younger participants. So the left-hand side is when the right plate was perturbed, and the right side was when the left plate was perturbed. I differentiated them in the statistical analysis just to rule out any differences between those. But essentially, we only performed 3 trials to keep the unexpected nature in, and previous studies found that there were no significant differences between trial 1 and trial 3. So we knew we were in unexpected territory. The effect sizes were all large, and as you can see, that you can't really see any pattern of recruitment through external oblique through to transversus abdominis, but that there is a lot of variability within each group, and there are significant differences between older and younger. So the next graph, the radar graph, shows quite clearly the blue outside radar are the older participants' muscle onsets, which were ranging from between 106 milliseconds for the first onset to, to 153 for the last muscle to onset, which meant there was a sort of a window of 47 milliseconds. And the younger participants, the grey on the inside, their first muscle recruited at 60 milliseconds after that perturbation, and the last muscle was 88. So their window was much, much closer. Arguably, both, 47 milliseconds and 28 milliseconds is a very, very short space of time. So both recruited quickly. But the important thing is we don't know whether actually those longer latencies, which might potentially fall within more of a voluntary reaction, that might be part of the problem, that there's not enough time for older participants to do something about the information, whereas younger participants perhaps can bring that postural response strategy much, much sooner. Future work, so tip of the iceberg, got so much data, but I'm interested really to see whether if training could perhaps modulate reaction time for older participants. Is there a way of identifying a way to make those risks be mitigated through a certain type of training? Currently, older adults tend to get prescribed, gentle walking, Pilates, yoga, Tai Chi, but there's not really a sort of motor control element to that apart from coordinated movement. So maybe something like dance, where reaction and quickness of movement perhaps might afford a better type of training to mitigate risk of fall, and that is me. Thank you.
Really interesting, Dr. Barford. So really good. And we'll ask all the questions at the end. So next up, we've got Chris Long, and unfortunately he couldn't make it today, but he has sent in his presentation, so he has recorded this for you. And so that should be coming up on your screen in a second. And yeah, so if you've got Chris's presentation now.
I'll just check you can see this.
Yeah, I can see your blue screen at the minute, but we can hear you. There you go. We've just lost you, Jeff. Oh, there we go.
Hi, I'm Chris Long. Apologies that I can't be there in person today. I'm going to talk to you about quantifying stabilization response to impact and some of the implications in this area across the lifespan. So I'm going to start off just by thinking about the importance of stability itself and what that is. So human postural stability is different to balance. So you can be balanced but unstable. You can be stable but unbalanced. Balance, if you think about a pencil standing on its end, standing on its lead, you can balance that, but it isn't stable because it has a very limited amount of resistance to having its state change. So it's very easy to knock over. So it might be balanced, but it's unstable, as opposed to something very, why say a mug? A mug sitting on a coaster is very stable because it has a higher level of resistance to being knocked over, and the more you fill that mug, the greater its resistance to being knocked over becomes. Okay, so stability is different to balance, and stability is essential, really, in fairly well everything that we try and do as human beings, as we move around and interact with the world, perform various tasks. Maintenance of stability, i.e., not falling over, is very key to being able to execute our day-to-day lives. That's not to say that it's easy. Lots of things throughout our existence challenge that stability. So that could be things like standing on a moving train. It could be bumping into people on the street as you move by. It could be, and it certainly is in my house, it could be standing up and your dog being in the way and knocking you over. And there are lots of things that can challenge that stability. Friction between slippery surfaces, walking across ice. There are lots of different things that challenge our stability. But it's a very important component in fairly well everything we do. It is something that we do monitor as sports scientists for a range of reasons. We can use it as a predictor of injury. So a reduction from a baseline in stability might be an indicator of injury. We can use it to monitor concussion, where we can see the worsening in diabetes, reduction in stability capacity or stabilization, worsening basic condition. We can see it as people get tired, their stability worsens, so we can monitor fatigue using it. It's a really useful tool, but it's a tool that comes with caveats, so that it alters a lot with maturation. Obviously, a toddler's capacity to remain upright is very different to 20-year-olds, and that is very different to an 80-year-old. So maturation effects, training effects, as we train different systems and we work for different sports, particularly for sport-specific adaptations, the stability of a rugby player is very different to the stability of a cyclist, for example. Also, anthropometry, particularly height and mass, can impact upon stability, as well as general levels of fitness. Just picking up on mass, so you could be very heavy for several reasons. A muscular person their stability will vary from a slim person because of their mass, but it will also differ from a fat person. So if there's a higher level of fat tissue on the feet, for example, that can cause a lack of stability, and so stability can vary. It's not just the fact that mass influences it, it's where that mass is and how it sits. So it's really, really specific, and as a result, we have to study it in a really specific and an individual way, thinking about different situations and the nature of the stability we're looking at. So that has been done really, really well, and really specifically in slips, in trips, and in falls. There's some really good established research and some really, really prominent research centres in those areas. However, we haven't really looked at how we respond to collision. So those things like getting bumped into in the street, my example of getting tripped over by the dog every time I go anywhere near the food cupboard, those sorts of things we haven't really looked at. There is an increasing propensity to have a look at this response to collision, or at least the nature of collision within a sporting context. And so my own area of research is in football codes, specifically rugby union, looking to understand the response to the tackle, sort of that collision there. And there are a range of devices and protocols that are in development to have a look at that, but they tend to lack any capacity to change. They are designed to answer a very specific research question, and there's certainly not any real general application of those findings. So if you take sort of the swinging tackle bag approach or the translating tackle bag approach that some people use to look at impact force in rugby, that's not a lot of use if I want to find out how a toddler is going to respond to a perturbation or an old person. It's not very useful in our walking down the street example. I'm not in the habit of rugby tackling people as I walk down the high street. Some of you may be, I don't know, but there's not a lot of generalizability around what is being studied currently. So what I've tried to do to affect that is we've designed this impact machine. So what this does is it delivers a known amount of force, hopefully a known amount of force in a known location. So it's a 3-meter high rig, and we can deliver that impact from 2 centimeters off the floor up to 200 centimeters or 2 meters of height. We can change the angle we release it from. We can change the mass of the bag. We can change the position. So basically, we can use this to investigate any source of perturbation we like. We can change the way around the bag is, so we can have a smaller focus area or a larger focus area. We can track different things to the pendulum arm. But essentially, what we've got is an electromagnet which releases a pendulum with an object on the end to impact upon a human participant. So we can then quantify their stabilization response through kinetic or kinematic measures, depending on your area of interest. So, as I say, the bag mass there is adaptable. It's a 3 kg on its own, but it's hollow. So we can add 2.2 kg sandbags, commercially available, and with the commercially available power bag. They go in there, and you can adjust the mass, and we can adjust the height using the machine settings. So what we did, just to have a look at and see how effective this machine was, we popped a force transducer in the wall. We used 5 different bag masses using those 2.2 kg increments, 7 different release angles. We took 10 trials at each mass and each angle on 2 different trial sessions to have a look at coefficient of variance for within session reliability and ICC for between session reliability, just to see if we are getting a consistent amount of force delivered in using this machine, and therefore say with some confidence that it works in what we're trying to get it to do. I should say that this was principally the masses and the angles were chosen because the area of research, I mean, as I mentioned, is in rugby union, so we're trying to replicate those sorts of forces, but obviously by using smaller angles, you would be able to use force more appropriate for studying different population groups. So a look at the results then. In terms of the release angle, you can see the coefficient of variance is lovely and low throughout there. We've got a steady increase in the graph, nice and tight standard deviation. So we can say certainly between 55 degrees and 80 degrees that we've got a fairly reliable and valid amount of force being delivered. It is a reliable and valid methodology. 85%, we start to see a change there. It is a reduction in the force that's delivered, which is fairly odd. So I would suggest that we need to do a little bit more work around what's going on at that higher release angle, see if it's a quirk in the machine, so what's happening there. But obviously the reliability is there with that really nice and low coefficient of variance. Those who don't use coefficient of variance, anything below 20% is generally acceptable in the field. In terms of the bag's mass, just using that 70-degree release angle, we did the 5 different bag masses again. Got a nice straightish sort of line, nice tight coefficient of variance sitting at 2%. Nice steady increase between the amount of force produced in newtons with each bag mass. We do see changing coefficient of variance at that highest mass, the 20.6, likely due to the increased amount of friction being placed upon the pendulum arm as it swings. So we've got a nice tight coefficient of variance, nice and low, and we've also got ICC between sessions at that 70-degree angle of 0.85. So in terms of the implications for this, we can say that we can reliably deliver a known quantity of force to research collisions and response to those collisions in the football codes. We could use it with combat sport athletes. We could potentially use this to understand the variance and stability between different ages and check the stabilization response differ. We can look at some real world challenges. We can really replicate impact for the first time and say, yes, this thing, so it might be that we're investigating an old lady standing up and bumping into the coffee table as she moves off from her armchair. We know that produces X amount of force. We can replicate that amount of force and study that individual response to it. So this is potentially really significant in terms of being able to fill that gap in the research around that sort of last area of disability that we have been looking at. So that's me. I would like to thank you for your time. Apologies again for my lack of presence. If you've got any questions, then please direct them to the research team, who will forward them on to me, and I will respond via email. Thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of the conference.
There we go. So that was Chris's presentation. As you can see, obviously pre-recorded for today's conference. And last but not least, we've got Lucy, who is one of our master's students. So she's going to be talking about the work she's doing for her master's project. So Lucy, whenever you're ready, do you want to just share your screen?
Yeah, I will do.
Fab. There we go. And whenever you're ready, over to you.
Thank you. So today I'll be looking through some of my research, which is into assessing left ventricular wall stress and mouth pressure during an isometric hand grip exercise between resistance trained and untrained men. So this will be today almost a case study looking at one resistance trained and one untrained man due to not having fully completed my study yet. So the rationale: there is a wealth of research focused on the effects of endurance and aerobic training on left ventricular structure and function. Within this, it has been shown that endurance trained individuals have a greater left ventricular mass, which is mainly characterized by increased internal cavity dimension with kind of the same left ventricular posterior wall thickness. However, there's less research investigating the effects of resistance training on left ventricular structure and function, and any data that has been previously collected is conflicting. Some studies have shown that resistance training causes an increase in left ventricular posterior wall thickness with a maintained internal cavity size, as you can see by the image on the left of the screen there, while others report no difference between resistance trained and untrained individuals. So this type of increase in wall thickness with a maintained cavity is known as concentric hypertrophy. And as you can see in the untrained image on the right, there is a significantly smaller wall thickness shown by the white arrow compared to the image on the left. So McDougall et al. In 1985 outlined that heavy resistance exercise causes an acute but significant increase in systolic blood pressure. And these may be contributed by what's known as the Valsalva maneuver, of which they found exercise performed at greater than 80% of max caused some individuals to Valsalva. This Valsalva maneuver reduces the transmural pressure gradient and helps protect the heart. And it has been shown that if a systolic pressure reaches or exceeds 250 milligrams of mercury, it's known as systolic mediated pressure load. And this can possibly lead to concentric hypertrophy. And this idea is consistent with findings in hypertensive individuals. Obviously, they experience high blood pressures maintained over a significant period of time. And within McDougall's study, he reported a peak systolic blood pressure of 320 millimeters of mercury whilst doing a leg press, and 255 millimeters of mercury in doing a bicep curl. However, even though this exceeds the systolic mediated pressure load, it can't be assumed that this will cause an increase in left ventricular mass or wall thickness, because the mechanism behind this still remains unclear. It is possible that with some studies not seeing an increase in left ventricular wall thickness, even though they saw increases in blood pressure, it might be because this increase in blood pressure isn't maintained for a long period of time, so that it can't induce any morphological changes within the heart structure, unlike in hypertensive individuals. So the aim of my study is to assess left ventricular wall stress and mouth pressure during an isometric hand grip exercise. And I hypothesise there will be no difference in the wall stress during an isometric hand grip exercise between the two groups. The methods involve, I collect a resting mouth pressure, echocardiogram scan and blood pressure. They will then complete an isometric hand grip maximal voluntary contraction so that I can then work out their 50, 80 and 90% of this for the exercise trials. And during the exercise trials, echocardiographic images, blood pressure and mouth pressure are recorded. The mouth pressure is collected by a microspirometer, as shown by the image on the right-hand side of the screen. And at each intensity, there were 3 trials, and averages of blood pressure and mouth pressure were recorded at each intensity. And during my analysis, all images achieved less than 2 on the quality grading scale. So all borders were visible and measurable, but some were seen to be slightly hazy. So this is a table looking at the untrained athlete, and as we can see, systolic blood pressure increased as intensity increased, apart from at 90% where it appeared to have dropped. Mouth pressure also increased during the exercise intensities. However, it's unsure as to whether they valsalved because the mouth pressure readings aren't that high. Their resting left ventricular posterior wall thickness is within normal ranges, 0.8. So there was no concentric hypertrophy seen in this individual. And their wall stress did increase slightly, but we did see a drop at 80-90%. We can't say as to why this occurred yet because this is just in one individual, but we could say in the 90%, the systolic blood pressure dropped and wall stress went back up again. However, in the trained individual, we did see a more significant increase in systolic pressure and a more significant increase in mouth pressure. And we are aware that this individual did valsalva. Again, their resting posterior wall thickness was within normal ranges. And by saying that the individual valsalved, shown by the mouth pressures of over 100, their wall stress did also drop at 90%, which is what we would expect to see with a valsalva. And the mouth pressure increasing quite significantly would also be a part of the systolic pressure increasing, as the valsalva maneuver has been shown to be a contributing factor to the increase in systolic blood pressure during resistance exercise. So these are 2 images of my heart scans from the trained and untrained individual. As you can see, there isn't a massive difference between the wall thickness, this is at rest, between the trained and untrained, which I expected to see within my data. However, during the partial analysis of the data collected so far, it has been shown that wall stress was lower in the resistance trained athlete, even though they had the same resting wall thickness. We can also see that wall stress dropped at 90% in the resistance trained athlete, which is likely due to the valsalva maneuver. So if wall stress decreases at greater than 80%, it can be suggested that if more data is collected within this area and wall stress does decrease at greater than 80%, resistance exercise at these intensities would be safe to use in clinical populations because there is limited stress on the heart compared to if there was no valsalva. Future research should encompass the assessment of strain and twist mechanics, and this is due to looking at the systolic wall thickness in the resistance trained athlete compared to the untrained athlete. So the systolic wall thickness increased in the resistance trained athlete, yet showed no change in the untrained individual. So this is likely to due to a different pattern of contractility within the heart. So research into twist and strain mechanics should also help understand whether it is to do with the different patterns of contractility rather than the baseline possible hypertrophy seen in some cases as a result of resistance training. So that is it.
Thanks, Lucy. That was really interesting. So we have got one question in the chat. If anybody else has got any questions, then please pop them in. So we'll have a quick answer from Cheryl in regards to this one, which says, congratulations on your presentation and your PhD completion too. What impact do you expect your research to have on the populations that have been investigated?
Hi, thanks for the question. So it's a really good question, because it's something that obviously my study differentiated, but we now need to take that to the next step. And that's why I said at the end, it's about looking to see whether any types of training or training that we typically use a lot in rehab to try and rehabilitate motor skills, for example, to see whether there is something that can be done to look at whether training can enhance the neuromuscular function of older adults, if that is if we can also nail whether it's the afferent-efferent control or whether it's supraspinal, because I think that will have an important part to play in terms of the type of activities or training that we're going to prescribe for the older adult, irrespective of the uptake buy-in, etc., etc. So that's what I'm hoping, is that if we are absolutely adamant that there are these differences in motor control and reaction times, then we need to work on that to mitigate the risk of a slip leading to a fall, which is inevitable. You know, you can't say that they're never going to fall. Even if you make the lighting brilliant and the footwear awesome, there's always going to be a slight risk of it. So that's what I'm hoping, that we can take it another few steps further.
No, it sounds really, really interesting. Definitely want to have a chat. That's really good. Okay, so quick break now, 5-minute break, well, nearly 10 minutes, up until 25 past, when we'll all come back, and we've got another student speaker, and we've also got our alumni keynote. So if you want to go put the kettle on and have a quick break and have a bit of an active 10 minutes, and I'll see you all back here at 25 past 12. So thanks. go and get a nice cuppa, and you've all done a bit of standing. So we are going to do the last of our current PhD students' presentations now. And this is from Abby Saunders. She unfortunately couldn't make it today, but has recorded a presentation for us. So we will be displaying that in a second before moving on to our alumni keynote. So we'll just get her presentation up now.
Good morning everyone, my name is Abby Saunders and I'm a PhD student here within the ISPAR department at the University of Bedfordshire. I'm here today to discuss my second study as part of my PhD programme, so a cross-sectional analysis of cardiac structure and function in resistance-trained athletes and untrained controls. Now, essentially my whole PhD project is around left ventricular hypertrophy within resistance-trained athletes. Now, cardiac remodeling as a physiological adaptation rather than as a pathological disease occurs following this prolonged stress on the myocardium that we experience in persistent exercise training. Now, this phenomenon is known as the athlete's heart, and it leads to these compensatory changes in the proportions of cardiac chambers in response to this hemodynamic demand of the exercise. And that often leads to favourable changes in cardiac function, so increases in stroke volume or transmitral velocities, which are favourable to the athlete. However, it's been suggested that with different exercise patterns, different training programs and different sports, there's a different hemodynamic demand on the heart. And this presents with a different type of left ventricular hypertrophy based on the athlete that's being examined. Now, this was demonstrated by Morgenroth et al. 1975, who looked at young collegiate males and examined cardiac structure using echocardiography. Now, in individuals engaged in isometric exercise, so strength-trained wrestlers and shot putters, these individuals presented with concentric hypertrophy. Now, this concentric hypertrophy is a greater left ventricular mass, but attributed due to this increase in wall thickness that's occurred as a result of exercise. However, the authors found those engaged in isotonic exercise, so long-distance swimmers and long-distance runners, these individuals had an eccentric pattern of hypertrophy. Now again, this eccentric hypertrophy is an increase in left ventricular mass overall, but not due to increases in wall thickness, but instead due to a greater left ventricular internal diameter, as you can see here on these diagrams. Now, my research is examining that concentric hypertrophy and that response that's occurring due to resistance exercise. And this has actually been a lot less frequently studied than endurance athletes or those engaged in isotonic exercise. Now, within my study, again, I want to look at younger adults and older adults, because older adults are often not examined, despite the fact that this is still an athletic population in many cases. Now, research that's examined younger adults has found this pattern of concentric hypertrophy in those engaged in resistance exercise. And in young individuals under the age of 40, this has occurred in males and females, where they've presented with greater left ventricular mass and wall thicknesses compared to their untrained counterparts who aren't engaged in any program of resistance exercise frequently or any program of endurance exercise frequently. However, research by Naylor et al. 2008 specifically has found that when we index these values of cardiac structure to indexes for body size, these changes are actually diminished. So yes, these individuals present with a larger left ventricular mass, but these are often larger individuals who are taller or who have greater muscle mass. Furthermore, in a review by Heikowski et al. 2002, the author actually found that the majority of resistance-trained athletes presented with a normal geometry of the heart. We can also examine the research investigating cardiac structure and function using echocardiography in older adults, so those greater than 40 years old. In research by Doris et al. 2021, the authors examined master athletes and compared their cardiac values for structure and function to standard reference values by Lang et al. 2015. Now, they found that those who were master athletes and still engaging in regular exercise, whether it be endurance or resistance exercise, presented with greater cardiac dimensions, including left ventricular volume and maximum left ventricular wall thickness, compared to these standard values we would see in an unchanged population. Furthermore, research by Wood et al. 2021 looked at IPSAR athletes aged 36 to 91. Now, while these individuals presented with normative cardiac parameters, so within those reference values presented by Lang et al. 2015, they found a strong positive correlation between age and left ventricular mass. However, they did find a strong positive correlation between age and left ventricular mass index to body surface area, as well as a strong correlation between left ventricular wall thickness and age. Now, the aim of this study is to use echocardiography to explore cardiac structure and function in the resistance-trained and untrained populations, but within younger and older adults. So typically we find in research in older adults, endurance and resistance-trained athletes are categorised together, even though we know these individuals have previously presented with different patterns of left ventricular hypertrophy. So this study will be examining 4 key groups: that resistance-trained younger population, resistance-trained older population, the untrained younger population, and the untrained older population. Now, our research question is going to be, is there a difference in cardiac structure and function due to chronic resistance training and or due to that natural aging process? Our first hypothesis being that resistance-trained athletes will have significantly greater overall cardiac mass, the left ventricular mass, due to this increase in myocardial wall thickness compared to their untrained counterparts. Now, our second hypothesis will be those resistance-trained athletes engaged in that chronic pattern of training will have no significant impairments to systolic or diastolic function, and that's why we've got our untrained counterparts to compare against. Now, as I said, we're looking at 4 key groups, so resistance-trained participants that are younger, resistance-trained participants that are older, untrained participants that are younger, and untrained participants that are older. Now, in all individuals, we want no previous history or family history of cardiovascular disease. We want our resistance-trained participants to be engaged in a heavy resistance training program, so greater than 4 sessions per week, where their main goal is to increase strength and muscle mass. They should be engaged in this for a minimum of 2 years, so training within this intensity, and have little aerobic component to their training program, so only 1 to 2 hours per week at maximum. Our untrained participants should be performing less than 150 minutes of moderate intensity exercise per week. And for our younger adults, these will be 18 to 40 years, and our older adults will be 60 to 80 years. When individuals arrive for their data collection, we're going to be taking height, body mass, body composition, resting blood pressure, and then their resting echocardiographic measures between the 4 groups that I discussed earlier. When we look at our echocardiographic analysis, I'm going to be looking at many views to obtain as many variables as possible. We'll be looking at the parasternal long axis, this first picture here, where we can look at wall thicknesses and diameters of the chamber, so of the left ventricle, the left atria, and the aorta. We're going to be rotating the ultrasound probe to then get a parasternal short axis, from which we can get strain analysis, which is analysis of the deformation of the heart, so how it moves with each contraction. We will then be moving the ultrasound probe lower down the body to obtain an apical 4-chamber view, as you can see in this right-hand picture, where we can clearly see each of the 4 chambers of the heart. From here, we can get the volumes of the left ventricle in diastole and systole, but we can also measure the velocity of the transmitral flow between the left atria and the left ventricle. And we can also look at longitudinal strain, another measure for deformation. We will then be tilting the transducer to get an apical 5-chamber view and rotating it to get a 2 and 3-chamber view. From here, we can look at more variables for volume and for strain, but we can also focus on diastolic function, and that's particularly important in our older adults and our older athletes. Now, this study is currently ongoing. Ethical approval was obtained in November 2020. Due to the COVID-19 pandemic, data collection has been slowed. So the table below indicates a summary of the data collection that's occurred so far. Now, as you can see, we've made initial contact with 16 resistance-trained athletes and 5 untrained controls. We've been working around complex calendars, and we've completed a full echocardiographic scan and data collection on 3 resistance-trained athletes and 5 untrained controls. Now, as I mentioned, this study is currently ongoing, with the hope that all data collection and echocardiographic analysis will be completed by the end of 2021. Thank you very much for listening. My email address and my Twitter handle are on the slide here, so if you have any further questions or interest in my research, please feel free to contact me. Thank you.
Lovely. Thanks for that, for Abby, for sending that one in. So hopefully you've enjoyed that presentation there from Abby. So last but not least, we have an alumni speaker. Our alumni keynote is Dr. Jack Wells, and he will be presenting today around golf. I'm not going to tell you too much, but this was one of our ref impact case studies at the University of Bedfordshire. So it's really exciting that he's come back to give us this talk. And if you have any questions for Jack, then please put them into the chat, and we'll do a question and answer session after this as well for him. So if you're ready, Jack.
Yeah, just bear with me.
All right.
Right, what screen can you see? Hold on.
Yes, if you put it into.
There we go. Right.
Yeah, that's perfect.
Cool. All right. Hello, everyone. So.
Oh, sorry, Jack. We've just got onto presenter mode for some reason.
Let's just. Sorry, let me just duplicate that. Is that better?
It is at the minute. Yep.
Okay, right. I'll have to change. I'll have to move the camera around. Okay, so right, a few tech issues, but here we go. So my name is Jack Wells, and this is my presentation, as it says, enhancing golf performance through biomechanical analysis. So a bit of my background. So I'm a lead sports scientist at the PGA. So I'm here at the moment. We're based at the Belfry, which is a pretty good setting to be based. I'm a consulting strength and conditioning coach with England Golf. So I work with England under 18s, England under 16s, just to try and basically help them play for England and hopefully go on to be professional golfers. I've recently set up, so I'm one of 3 co-founders of the Golf Performance Network, which I'll briefly mention later on. And kind of from my position, primarily based at PGA, I felt that I had a really unique opportunity to assess golfers because I was working with a lot of very, very good golfers. So looking at a lot of the research within golf has typically involved older players, players of a low standard, and there's very little stuff that's been done with good players. And I'm interested in biomechanics and strength and conditioning. So this kind of led me to embark on a PhD, which is basically biomechanics and strength and conditioning for golf. So the other thing that I want to talk about today is I need to come up with a better title on this, but I sort of say the so what factor. So when people talk about research to me, I'm always very much like, so what? Yeah, what does that mean? Because I'm heavily involved with practitioner and the end user, I really need to understand clearly what your research means, because I might have to disseminate that to players that I work with. So I will come up with a more catchy title, but I've used this for a little while. So my general research question was to assess the relationships between vertically orientated tasks. Now, vertically orientated tasks are things like vertical jumps. Another example of a vertically orientated task might be a deadlift or a back squat. And I wanted to see if vertically oriented tasks related to club head velocity within highly skilled and elite golfers. So the rationale for this, so this is a picture of a golfer in their downswing, and the black arrows represent the force vectors. And you can see that the arrow for the right foot is pointing towards the target, the arrow in the left foot is pointing away from the target. So there's medial lateral forces, so they're working left and right. If you look at this picture on the right, the force vector here in the left foot is pointing forwards, and the force vector here is pointing backwards. And again, we know that forces work backwards and forwards in this swing. So if you imagine their feet, they're working like that. But as you can see, these arrows are pretty big. They're pretty high. Okay. And that means that the vertical ground reaction forces are pretty high. And within the golf swing, the greatest magnitude of ground reaction forces within all 3 vectors is in the vertical direction. So that tells us that vertical ground reaction forces are important. And in actual fact, vertical ground reaction forces are extremely large for big hitters. Now, some research in the past has used things like jump height, and that kind of makes sense because actually if we want to jump higher, we need to produce more vertical ground reaction forces. So if I did a vertical jump and then I did another one and I produced more force, I'll jump higher. But if you look at different golfers, their mass is completely different. So mass is a massive confounding variable for jump height, because if someone's heavier, they've got to produce more force to jump the same height as a lighter individual. So there's real issues with using jump height. We could use peak power, but I'm actually not a massive fan of peak power. I could probably spend an hour talking about why I don't really like power as a variable. But peak power is an instantaneous moment in time. So if I'm using force plates and I'm sampling at 1,000 hertz, that means in Excel, I've got 1,000 columns of data for 1 second worth of recording. And the peak power is the single time point when power is at its greatest. So that represents 0.001 seconds. So are we really going to try and compare performance during such a small time period? I sort of question the value in that. Now, we could look at something like a 1 repetition maximum back squat, because this has been found to relate to club head velocity. But the problem is, a bit like the golf swing, you could be a really strong individual but not know technically how to swing a golf club. And club head velocity is essentially generated by both skill, i.e. how good you are at swinging a golf club, and the capacity, how much force you can produce. And the same can be said for something like a back squat. Okay, you could be really strong, but actually you just don't know how to lift the load. And trust me when I say a lot of golfers are very inexperienced in performing a repetition maximum test. So although researchers found that these variables relate to club head velocity, there are inherent issues with this. So this kind of led me on to my first study. So I had 27 highly skilled players, and they had a handicap of 5.4. So basically, they will on average shoot 5 shots over the round. Okay, so they're good players. We measured club head velocity with a launch monitor. And then we use vertical jumps to measure impulse. Now, impulse is calculated as how much force you produce during a given period of time. So you can increase impulse by producing more force in the same period of time, or by producing the same average force over a longer time period. And we used an isometric mid-thigh pull, which is a really good way of measuring almost maximum strength. And this is a good way of measuring peak force. So we used vertical jumps to measure impulse, and we used an isometric mid-thigh pull to measure peak force. And we used force plates to analyze this. Now, this is a really novel design because no research had looked at this number of good golfers using force plates. Any research that had used force plate with golfers, the only other study that was remotely comparable had golfers with an average handicap of 14, and the standard deviation for the handicap was 7. So really varied in skill level, and they only had 12 participants. So this was quite novel in its design. Now, to give you an idea as to what's involved here, these are 2 really high-profile players that both play on the European Tour, and that kind of gives away a bit about what I'm going to talk about later on. But I'm just going to show you the counter movement jump first, what this looks like on force plates. And then this is the isometric mid-thigh pull. You notice that their angles don't really change here. Okay, now the players love this. The dull bit for us is we get all these really weird squiggly lines and then we have to analyze it. But yeah, that's fine. We can do that. So what we found from these tests, we found that counter movement jump impulse significantly related to club head velocity. And the R value, as you can see, is pretty strong. We also found that isometric mid-thigh pull peak force significantly related to club head velocity as well. And from an impact point of view, which is why I'm here to talk, impulse, essentially what that said to us is, right, if we want to try and help a golfer to, and I know this is a relationship, but thinking further down the line, essentially we want to try and increase impulse. So we need to try and increase force in some way. So what we talk about with golfers is, why don't you warm up, or why don't you engage in resistance training? That will help you to increase force. Or you could increase the time in which force acts. So classically for a golfer, it is lengthening the backswing, okay, because they've got much longer time to produce force. So that's the sort of way we would try and communicate this with the player. Peak force, this was a nice message because golfers are kind of terrified of getting strong. They think they're going to get injured. They think they're going to lose range of movement. But actually this sort of said, you know what, this is really picking up that stronger people have higher club head velocity. That was a really nice message for us as practitioners. But the big thing with this happened, and this was a bit of a snowball effect. I presented at the World Scientific Congress of Golf in 2016. And in that talk, after the talk, I kind of got grabbed by an individual who was called Roger Hawkes. And he was the Chief Medical Officer for the European Tour. And he said, Jack, I've seen your research. I'm really interested in this. Can you come down to the PGA BMW, which is the highest profile tour that the European Tour put on? And that's hosted at Wentworth. So I was pretty nervous, and I went down and I presented in. They've got this physio truck. They've got this truck that drives to every single European Tour event. And in there, they've got physio couches, they've got a gym, they've got ultrasound to test wrist injuries, they've got doctors where they can give medicine to the players. And it's basically a safe place where players can work out, exercise, warm up before a round. And I went down there and presented my information to the physios and the doctors and the S&C coaches. I got an absolute grilling, but afterwards they sort of said, we absolutely love this. We're really interested in this. We want to use this with our players, but can you come and work with us and with our players and test them? So I was kind of like really taken back by that, which was, for me, it was like quite a proud moment. But anyway, that led on to my next study. So you might recognize a few people here. So this was, we actually conducted this at Luton Hoo. So you've got Ian there. Ian's one of my supervisors. So you've got Ian testing one of the players with like a mobile isometric mid-thigh pull rig. You've got Simon at the top, who's leaning over Ian. He's an S&C coach for the European Tour. And this is like real life in the world field, taking the lab, i.e. the force plates, out in the field to get these measurements. So we've got 31 Challenge Tour players. So these are some like seriously good golfers. And we measured club head velocity at the range with the TrackMan. So we took the launch monitor out, we got to the range. Golfers, as you imagine, love hitting balls. And then we measured cat movement, jump impulse, and isometric mid-thigh pull peak force. And that was at Luton Hoo, which was the host venue for the event. Now, what we found, we ran a regression, and we found that cat movement jump impulse accounted for 37.9% of the variance in club head velocity. And for anyone interested in like effect sizes, when you look at the effect size, that is absolutely massive. It is really, really, really big. So again, we were sort of really taken back by this. What we did further, and I certainly recommend doing a regression. I'm going to talk a little bit about this. If you are running a regression, I massively recommend doing this from a communication point of view. And you'll see how I sort of take research into a bit of an art or a communication with the players. So with a regression, you get standardized beta coefficient. And what you can do is you can basically work out how much they can increase their club head velocity or whatever predictor variable you're using by increasing the a criterion variable. So I got the standardized beta coefficient, and then I multiplied that by the standard deviation for club head velocity. Now, this was the standardized beta coefficient, 0.616, and the standard deviation for all of the players was 6.15 miles an hour. And that basically gave me 3.78 miles an hour. So what this means is if these Challenge Tour players can increase their counter movement jump impulse by 46.85 Newton seconds, that would lead to an increase of essentially 3.78 miles an hour. Now, that's using the stats and the research to really make that palatable for the players. So we could say to them, hey, look, if you want to increase your club head speed by 3 to 4 miles an hour, this is what we want to go after. This is what we want to use as practitioners. And this was so valuable for the European Tour. And to take it even further, 3 miles an hour roughly equates to 10 yards. Now, for a golfer, they will know that the gapping between clubs is around 10 yards. So if I hit a drive off the tee, if I hit it 10 yards shorter than I wanted, I might have to take a longer club, like a 5-iron. And now longer clubs, you tend to hit with less control. Now, if I got them to hit the ball 10 yards further, rather than taking a 5-iron, they could take a 6-iron, which means they've got much more control over the ball. It's an easier approach shot onto the green. If they've got an easier approach shot onto the green, they've got an easier chance of making a putt. So for them, they're like, this is brilliant. This is really going to help me out as a player. And for them, it's money. They can earn more money. So it's a huge value for them. So some of the other practical impact from this, which is was really important. So we use counter movement jump impulse for accountability and benchmarking. So the force plates don't really lie. So we know if someone's been engaging in the S&C program. So if we measure them again and they've actually been doing what we're doing, we can be confident that he's going to have these changes. But if they don't, it puts a bit of accountability on them as a player. It's amazing for goal setting. So we can say, look, we want to try and increase your impulse by 4 to 6 newton seconds. So it's great for goal setting. And also it negates for the issues around mass and power. So there's some real practical advantages of impulse. Now for the isometric mid-thigh pull peak force, picture this. When we work with our players, we can only really test them at events. So imagine a player's coming to the Open and we want to test them. Is it really realistic to say to the player, right, you know, I know it's the Open, but fancy doing a repetition maximum back squat to see how strong you are? But these players are just going to be like, absolutely no way, because they know it's going to tire them out, it's going to fatigue them, and they're going to be a little bit scared of it. So if we do an isometric mid-thigh pull, there's no DOMs with that because it's an isometric action, so they don't get any aches and pains. It's just not scary at all. So they're more likely to do it. There's no technique issues. Okay, so you don't need to really know how to do it. You just pull as hard as you can. And it does look a bit golfy as well. It's like they're standing in their address position, so they can really relate to it. And I was really fortunate afterwards. So when I handed in my PhD, I actually submitted this for my PhD, but the European Tour sent me a 2-page letter, basically just thanking me for what I did and how impactful my research was. And I would say I got asked in my exam, and if you're going into your Viva, they'll probably ask you one of the last questions, or one of the first questions is, what was the proudest moment of your PhD? And this for me was absolutely it. And when I said that to my examiners, they were like, yeah, this is what you should be really proud of. And just to give you an extract of this, because the whole thing would probably take a little bit of time to read. So they said this: had it not been for your research undertaken by you and your team, we would not have implemented a standardized profiling procedure for PGA European Tour players. And just to kind of put this into context, the Ryder Cup is starting, I should know, it's starting today. Some of the players that are playing in the Ryder Cup have been tested using these procedures. They might actually be there out there now being tested using these procedures. And that for me is like a really sort of proud moment of my PhD, and something that I reflect on quite a lot. And just to give you a bit of guidance how they use this, they use this sort of just decision tree to almost guide the interventions they make. So the first thing they look at is isometric mid-thigh pull high? If it's not, then they train strength. If it is, then they ask, right, okay, is counter movement jump impulse high? If it's not, then we need to train impulse. If it is, then they look at dynamic strength index, and then they'll guide their training from there. The other impact statement I got was from England Golf. So I developed these more recent procedures that we could actually utilize without force plates to calculate net impulse. Again, England Golf are very kind to write an impact statement saying how this has impacted their players. And this is just an extract from that. So based on your research, we now utilize impulse as a key performance indicator for both our male and female national and regional programs, a total of 208 players. Okay, so these are some of the best young junior, or they are the best young junior players in the country. And they moved away from using, I did a presentation to them online at a conference, and they moved away from using jump height and power, and they now use a measure of impulse. So just some practical advice that I have moving forwards, and that's helped me. If you're in a position to do this, absolutely speak with players and coaches and understand the issues. And I think the closer you get to the sport, the better you are to deal with the tasks. My first day with England Golf, I walked out on the range with the player, with the sort of coach, head coach, and she said, "Jack, what do you see the issue is with this player looking at their swing?" Bear in mind, I'm an S&C coach, and luckily because I understood the sport, I could actually spot it. She was like, yeah, absolutely, big issue with that. But that helped me to cater my intervention as well. I would engage in trying to play and participate in the sport as well and understand the sport. So if I went to a player, okay, this, yeah. So if you pick up your golf bat, they're just going to look at me and go, this guy has no idea about golf, okay? So try and play and participate in the sport, and you will understand the nuances of the game. Talk coaching language. So if I said to a player, we've analyzed the standardized beta coefficient, and if we multiply that by the standard deviation, that's going to lead to this. So it's understanding the biomechanics or the in-depth stuff. That's your sort of your knowledge box, but your coaching box is to talk the art and talk to the players and understand them. I massively recommend disseminating at different levels, so publications, but also conferences. A conference was a big one for me because that led to a snowball effect, but also social media as well. And you can include things like magazine articles, just talking to coaches, just talking to players, and dissemination at different levels is absolutely huge for me. A big question here is to supervisors and people that go on to supervise is actually, what are you looking for? If you looked at me on paper, I was someone that actually at year 4 at school, I actually couldn't read very well. If you looked at my GCSE grades, they'd be okay. If you looked at my A levels, they'd be okay. On paper, I am not a great PhD candidate. But I do quite like stats. I don't know why, but I do quite like stats. But I would say there'd be more academic people out there than me. But as supervisors, you have the skills, and my supervisors do as well. They manage me really, really well as a team. They understood my strengths and they understood my weaknesses. But if you're a supervisor and you're looking at an individual, I would really, if you're interviewing them, how do they come across an interview? Because they've got to be a salesperson. They've got to talk to people. What qualities can they bring to the table that you're not able to get? If you're looking at someone that's just a number cruncher and just got really high grades at every level, okay, I think there's more to people than that. I think there's more to some people that actually could achieve a really good PhD. And I probably would have been a high risk PhD candidate, but hopefully the research has been impactful and it's made a difference to people. The last thing I just want to talk about is this has kind of led myself and two other colleagues here. So Simon and Dan both work with the European Tour. Dan's the head of sport and science and medicine at England Golf, and Si is SSC coach with England Golf and with the European Tour. So we set up the Golf Performance Network because we feel that education in golf around sort of sports science and medicine is really poor. It's not only sort of not great, it's actually wrong. So we've kind of got quite a few bases covered. So we're all sort of S&C background, but I'm more biomechanics. Dan's a physio and Si is pure S&C. So if people are interested in looking at some of the stuff we put out, we are on social media and you can look at the Golf Performance Network, but you could also look at our website and have a look what we do there. So yeah, I just want to say thanks very much. I always take the time to thank my supervisors as well, to Ian Fletcher, Andrew Mitchell and Laura Cheryl Lambert. Okay, they were instrumental in me throughout my PhD for a number of different reasons. So thank you very much.
Amazing, Jack. Thank you. That was really, really interesting. Not massively into golf, but really like the biomechanics side of things. So for me, that was really exciting. I know we have a question from your supervisor already, so he's already called dibs on first round. So Andrew, have you got a question for Jack?
Yeah, I think initially it's not really a question, it's just filling in a little bit more information. Jack's been very modest here. What he hasn't really shared, I know you referred to it slightly, Rebecca, but as a PhD student, Jack's research was the focus of a ref case study. So the unit assessment that ISPAR focuses around was allowed 2 ref case studies, and one was Professor Chater and her colleagues. The second was Jack's work. His publications all secured prior to his PhD viva, and the statements of testimony from organisations like the PGA, European Tour, England Golf, the European Challenge Tour, alongside testimonies from golfers, clinicians, sports scientists, were absolutely fundamental in showing the impact of this research. And in short, these organisations, as Jack mentioned, are now testing and monitoring their golfers using the novel methods that Jack put together that are in Jack's research. They purchased equipment to carry out the testing that's in Jack's research, and they employed people to do the testing. And I think it's very, very difficult for me to underplay how significant that is for a PhD student to come, 6 months after his viva, even less than that, for me to give him a call and say, would you help us put together a ref case study on your work? In my opinion, Jack's an absolute inspiration and a role model, not just for PhD students, but for any academic listening into this presentation. And Professor Chater, Angel will kind of be banging on about this for the next ref cycle. We can't just publish research. We need to publish impactful research that makes people change what they're doing. And as Jack has said here, he absolutely fundamentally did that And considering we had a reasonably short deadline to get this done for other reasons, just want to kind of call out Jack for helping and giving us all the support he did. But realistically, we've had one of our F case studies was kind of done around work from Professor Chater and her colleagues with many years of experience and contacts kind of both nationally and globally. And the other one was focused around the research of an excellent academic who just happened to be a recently graduated PhD student. So it's just a big credit to you, Jack. Excellent effort, mate.
Thanks very much. That's very kind of you, Andrew. Really appreciate that.
Yeah, and I think that raises the point of if you are a PhD student and you think your work's going to have some type of impact, like Jack said, get in contact with coaches and get out there and make sure you're presenting at conferences, and start thinking about where that research could go. I think that's really exciting. We've got bits in the comments if you want to look at more about the impact case study, you can go do that as well. So I am quickly just going to round up from today. So I'm just going to share my screen just in case you, oh no, if that, we're good. I think I'm just on the wrong screen. So we're there, I think. If we're not, don't panic. I don't know why these aren't working. There we go. So massive thanks to everyone. You've been a part of the ISPAR conference. So if you've been a presenter, massive thank you to participating. If you've come along and you've just watched, engaged, if you've asked a comment, again, thank you ever so much. And massive thanks to everyone that contributes to the whole of this conference in any shape or form. So whether you're an organizer, you're a person that I've roped in to do something or just help me out. If you've got any questions, then please get in touch. So my email address is on there, but there's also the generic one for ISPAR if you want to speak to someone about any aspect across any of the days, or you want to get in touch with any of the speakers and you might have questions about the work that they're doing. You can also contact most of our speakers, I think, on Twitter as well. And we've got loads of tweets going out from the ISPAR Twitter account as well, if you want to have a look at them. So thank you very much for listening. And if you've got any questions, then feel free to put them in the chat. Or if you just want to speak to me or email me later, then please do. And for the rest of you, I'm 2 minutes over time. So go away, have a lovely lunch. And hopefully I will see you all soon. So thanks.